Beneath the wheat fields, beneath the highways, beneath the villages whose church bells ring over quiet European mornings, there is another Europe. It has no written histories, no royal chronicles, no carved lists of kings. It does not announce itself with pyramids rising above the sand or palace walls still standing against the sky. It lies lower, pressed into the soil as stains, post holes, burned floors, broken figurines, copper tools, graves, clay symbols, and the ghostly outlines of houses that disappeared thousands of years before Rome had a name. To find it, archaeologists do not step into a lost city with towers intact. They peel back the land, centimetre by centimetre, until the familiar continent begins to look unfamiliar, and Europe's deep past opens like a buried room. This is the strange thing about the lost civilization hidden beneath Europe. It was never hidden by one catastrophic event alone. No single volcanic eruption sealed it under ash. No desert swallowed it whole. No jungle grew over its temples. Instead, time erased it slowly, patiently, almost politely. Wooden walls rotted. Clay houses collapsed. Fields were ploughed again and again by people who never knew what lay under their feet. Rivers shifted. Forests returned. Later cultures built over earlier ones. Empires came, fought, wrote, boasted, and fell, while beneath them remained the traces of a much older world, a world that had already known farming, craft specialization, long-distance exchange, ritual life, social ranking, and settlements so large that scholars still debate whether some of them should be called cities. Long before the classical world, before the Celts, before the Greeks told stories of heroes crossing wine-dark seas, before bronze swords flashed in battle, parts of Europe were already changing in ways that would reshape human history. In the valleys of the Danube, on the plains north of the Black Sea, across the Balkans and into Central Europe, communities were experimenting with something powerful and dangerous permanence. They were learning how to remain in one place, how to grow food from the same soil, how to build houses meant not for a season but for generations, how to store grain, raise animals, make pottery, bury the dead close to the living, and imagine a future tied to a particular landscape. That may sound simple from a distance. It was not. To settle down is to make a bargain with the earth. It gives stability, but it also creates dependence. It gives abundance, but it also invites competition. It gives memory a home, but it also makes loss more painful. What survives in the records suggests that this early Europe was not a single empire or one united people. It was more like a web of related worlds, each with its own traditions, materials, symbols, and rhythms. Some villages were small and modest. Others grew astonishingly large. Some communities worked copper with skill that seems almost too early. Others buried their dead with gold that predates the treasures of Egypt's pharaohs. Some left behind tiny signs scratched into clay, marks that have tempted generations to imagine a lost script, though the evidence remains incomplete and scholars still debate what these symbols actually meant. Across this landscape, people made objects of beauty and strangeness, seated figures with unreadable faces, decorated vessels, polished stone axes, shell ornaments carried far from the sea, and houses deliberately burned so fiercely that their walls hardened like pottery. There is something unsettling about these remains because they do not belong to the Europe most people imagine. They come from a time when the continent was still becoming itself. The familiar borders did not exist. The languages that would later dominate Europe had not yet spread in their historic forms. Many of the landscapes looked different. Forests were thicker. Rivers wandered through marshes and floodplains, wild cattle, deer, boar, wolves, and bears moved through regions that later became farms and towns. Human communities lived close to both opportunity and danger, and the line between survival and failure could be thin. A harvest could fill storage pits and feed a settlement through winter, or it could fail and expose how fragile settled life really was. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because this story is not about a fantasy Atlantis beneath Europe, and it is not about a vanished super-civilization with impossible technology. The real mystery is quieter, older, and in some ways more powerful. It is the story of how complex societies can rise without writing, how they can flourish for centuries without becoming kingdoms, and how they can disappear so thoroughly that only fragments remain to suggest the scale of what was lost. The first shock comes from the dates. By the 5th and 4th millennia BC, thousands of years before the Parthenon, before Stonehenge reached its final form, before the Great Pyramid rose on the Giza Plateau, communities in southeastern Europe were already producing remarkable material culture. In the Varna cemetery near the Black Sea, graves contained some of the earliest known worked gold in the world. In the lands of the Cucuteni Trapilia culture, enormous settlements spread across the forest steppe, some arranged in vast rings of houses, with populations that may have reached into the thousands or even tens of thousands, depending on how one interprets the evidence. In the Vinča world of the Balkans, people built dense settlements, made distinctive figurines, and marked objects with signs that remain tantalizingly difficult to explain. Yet this world never speaks directly. That is the great silence at the center of the story. The people who lived in these settlements did not leave behind histories in the way later civilizations did. No king tells us he conquered a river valley. No priest explains a ritual. No farmer complains about taxes. No child's name survives with certainty. Archaeology must work from what the ground preserves, and the ground is selective. It keeps fired clay better than wood, metal better than cloth, bone better than breath. It preserves disaster more vividly than ordinary peace. A burned house leaves a strong trace. A lifetime of quiet meals leaves almost none. So the lost civilization beneath Europe is not reconstructed from a full archive. It is assembled from shadows, patterns, absences, and stubborn material facts. And still, those facts are enough to change the story. They reveal a continent not waiting passively for civilization to arrive from elsewhere, but actively shaping its own experiments in social life. These people cleared forests, planted fields, raised cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, exchanged goods across surprising distances, built communities with repeated plans, developed rituals around homes and ancestors, and created forms of wealth and status that could be buried with the dead. They lived in a world of clay, timber, grain, smoke, copper, salt, and seasonal light. Their civilization did not look like Mesopotamia or Egypt, and that is exactly why it matters. It reminds us that complexity does not always wear the same face. The mystery deepens because this world did not simply become the Europe of later history. It changed, fragmented, and in many places faded. Settlements were abandoned, traditions ended or transformed, new burial customs appeared, new people moved across the landscape. The steppe opened its long horizon, climate shifted, networks broke and reformed. No single explanation fully accounts for this. Some communities may have declined because soils were exhausted or forests retreated. Others may have been affected by changing weather, conflict, disease, migration, or internal social strain. In the archaeological record, collapse rarely looks like one dramatic ending. More often, it looks like uneven silence spreading across a map. To stand over one of these buried sites today is to feel the distance between evidence and imagination. There may be no grand ruin visible, only a field, a low rise, a scatter of pottery, a darker patch in the soil where a wall once stood. But beneath that quiet surface are the remains of choices made thousands of years ago where to place a house, where to store grain, where to bury a child, where to leave an offering, when to burn a dwelling, when to abandon a place that had once seemed permanent. The people of this hidden Europe did not know they were prehistoric. They did not think of themselves as a mystery. They lived at the centre of their own world, under skies as real as ours, with fears and hopes that left only partial traces behind. And that is where the story begins, not with a lost city suddenly discovered intact, but with a buried continent of human experiments, a forgotten foundation beneath Europe's later civilizations. The soil remembers what history forgot. The question is how much of that memory can still be read. Long before Europe has nations, borders, alphabets, or empires, it has weather, rivers, animals, forests, and people moving through them with a knowledge that is intimate rather than written. The continent is not empty, and it is not waiting for history to begin. For tens of thousands of years, human groups have crossed its plains, sheltered in its caves, followed herds, gathered plants, made tools, buried their dead, painted and carved images, and learned the moods of landscapes that change with ice, warmth, flood, and drought. By the time the first farming villages begin to appear, Europe already carries a deep human past. It is not a blank stage. It is an old world entering a new and uncertain phase. The Europe before cities have names is a continent of edges. Forest meets grassland, mountain meets river valley, shoreline meets marsh. The climate is warmer than the harshest Ice Age centuries, but it is not stable in the way modern people sometimes imagine. Seasons matter intensely. A cold spring can delay growth. A dry summer can weaken plants and animals. A long winter can test stored food and human patience. Wild resources are abundant in many regions, but abundance is never evenly distributed. Deer move, fish runs vary, nuts ripen or fail, herds shift their routes. The people who live by hunting, gathering, fishing, and seasonal movement understand this world with extraordinary skill, but their lives are tied to mobility, memory, and flexibility. Then a different way of living begins to press into the continent from the southeast. Farming does not arrive like a single invention dropped onto Europe all at once. It moves unevenly, carried by people, adopted by some communities, resisted or ignored by others, reshaped by local conditions. The first farmers bring crops and domestic animals whose deeper origins lie beyond Europe, in the long arc of lands stretching through Anatolia and the Near East. They bring wheat, barley, peas, lentils, sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, pottery traditions, polished stone tools, and the habit of building more permanent homes. But what matters most is not any single object. It is the new relationship between human beings and place. To plant grain is to trust the future in a new way. Seeds go into the earth with the expectation that people will still be there when the plants ripen. Houses become more than shelters, they become anchors. Storage becomes power. Land becomes memory. A field cleared by one generation can be known by the next. Paths between houses become familiar. Burials near settlements bind the dead into the geography of the living. Slowly, the village becomes a kind of argument against wandering too far. It says stay, build, return, inherit. This change does not erase the older world. For a long time, farmers and foragers live near one another, trade with one another, learn from one another, and perhaps sometimes distrust one another. Scholars still debate the details of these relationships in different regions, because the evidence varies from place to place. In some areas, farming seems to spread mainly with migrating communities. In others, local foragers adopt pieces of the farming package at their own pace. The old division between hunter-gatherer and farmer can be too neat. Human lives are rarely so tidy. Some groups may plant crops while still hunting widely. Others may keep animals while continuing to rely heavily on rivers, forests, and wild foods. What survives in the record suggests not one clean replacement, but a long and complicated reshaping. The earliest villages are not yet cities, but they contain the seeds of something larger. They require cooperation. Fields must be cleared, houses must be built, animals must be watched, harvest must be gathered and protected, clay must be dug and fired, tools must be made, repaired, exchanged, and sometimes treasured. Food surplus does not automatically create hierarchy, but it makes new forms of inequality possible. A family with full storage pits may pass winter differently from one with empty ones. A person who controls valued materials, ritual knowledge, livestock, or exchange connections may gain influence. In a world without written law, status can still be visible in the body, the house, the grave, and the objects placed beside the dead. The houses themselves begin to change the land. Many early European farming communities build with timber, wattle, daub, reeds, and clay. These materials do not endure like stone, yet they leave traces, lines of post holes, hardened floors, fragments of wall plaster, ash layers, and the darkened outlines of pits. Archaeologists read these traces with a patience that can seem almost impossible. A stain in the earth becomes a wall. A cluster of post holes becomes a house. A scatter of burned grain becomes a meal interrupted, a storage accident, or a destruction event. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is enough to show that these were not temporary camps. These were places made to be lived in, repaired, remembered, and sometimes rebuilt over older footprints. One lesser-known detail is how much early farming life depends on sound, smell, and texture that rarely survive archaeologically. A village would not have been silent. There would be cattle lowing near enclosures, dogs moving between houses, grinding stones, rasping grain into flour, children carrying water, smoke leaking from hearths, insects rising from dung and stored crops, and the damp smell of clay walls after rain. The beauty of polished axes and painted pots can distract from the physical density of the settlement itself. These were living places, not museum displays. They were crowded with tasks, waste, heat, hunger, routine, and ritual. As villages multiply, Europe becomes a mosaic. In one region, longhouses stretch across cleared land. In another, tells rise slowly as people build again and again on the same mound, creating layered settlements of accumulated life. In river valleys, communities gain access to fish, fertile soils, transport routes, and seasonal flooding. On low plains, easily worked soils encourage cultivation. Near mountains, stone, ores, salt, and pasture offer different possibilities. The shape of civilization here is not dictated by one capital or one ruler. It grows from many local experiments. This is why the phrase lost civilization must be handled carefully. It can mislead if it suggests one kingdom with a single name. The buried old world beneath Europe is better understood as a family of related transformations. Some cultures share styles of pottery or house forms. Others share exchange networks, ritual habits, or technological knowledge. Boundaries are porous. Influence moves. People marry, travel, trade, imitate, and adapt. A pot style can spread without an army. A ritual object can travel farther than the person who made it. A technique for working copper can move through hands and workshops long before anyone writes down the recipe. Still, something remarkable is beginning. The continent's older mobile lifeways do not vanish everywhere, but in many regions the centre of gravity shifts towards settlement, cultivation, and accumulation. Time itself begins to feel different. Farmers live by the calendar of sowing and harvest, lambing and slaughter, storage and scarcity. The future becomes something that can be planned for, but also something that can fail. This is one of the quiet turning points in human history. A settled community can grow, remember, specialize, and create astonishing continuity. It can also become vulnerable to drought, disease, conflict, crop failure, and the exhaustion of its own land. Beneath later Europe, then, lies not merely a collection of ancient villages, but the first great experiment in making the continent domestic. Forests are opened, fields appear, paths harden between settlements, clay vessels carry patterns that mark belonging, the dead remain close, the living return to the same doorways. No one yet writes the names of these places in durable script, and no one knows that thousands of years later their homes will be visible only as stains in the soil. But the transformation has begun. Europe is becoming a landscape of roots, and from those roots, something larger will grow. The first farmers who move into Europe do not arrive as conquerors in the later imperial sense. They come with families, animals, seeds, habits, fears, and memories of other landscapes. Their movement is not a single march across the continent, but a long human tide, advancing through river valleys, coastlines, plains, and mountain gaps over centuries. Some communities settle quickly in fertile places, others pause, split, merge, or disappear from the record. What begins in the southeast slowly reaches deeper into Europe, and with every generation the old balance between movement and settlement changes. The roots of this farming world reach back toward Anatolia and the wider Near Eastern zone where wheat, barley, sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs had already been drawn into human life. By the time these practices reach southeastern Europe, they are not experimental in the simplest sense. People know how to sow and harvest. They know how to manage herds, shape pottery, grind grain, and build houses with durable plans. Yet Europe is not the same as the lands they or their ancestors came from. Its forests are different, its winters can be sharper, its soils vary greatly, its rivers flood in their own rhythms. Farming must be translated into a new continent. That translation is one of the most important and least dramatic revolutions in European history. A crop that grows well in one valley may struggle in another. Animals need pasture, water, protection, and winter fodder. Forest must be cut or burned to open fields, but woodland also provides fuel, timber, nuts, game, and shelter for wild animals. The first farmers cannot simply impose a ready-made system on the land. They must learn it season by season. The evidence remains incomplete. But what survives suggests that early farming spread through both confidence and adjustment. These communities carry a powerful way of life, but they are also students of the land they enter. The Balkans become one of the great gateways. Here, Farming communities establish settlements in zones where river routes, fertile basins, and access to raw materials create conditions for growth. From southeastern Europe, agricultural lifeways move north and west, not always smoothly, not always at the same speed. Some areas become dense with villages, others remain more mixed, where foragers and farmers live in proximity for long periods. Scholars still debate the precise human stories behind this spread. How much came from migrating people? How much from local adoption? How often the two blended into families whose descendants could no longer be sorted into simple categories? Genetic evidence has sharpened the picture, but it has not made it simple. The past is rarely generous enough to fit one clean explanation. To imagine the arrival of farming only as technology is to miss its emotional weight. A farming family carries more than grain. It carries a way of organizing the day. Dawn brings animals to tend, hearths to revive, fields to inspect, tools to mend. Children grow up learning the shape of a home as something fixed. Elders can point to the work of earlier years, a cleared patch, a repaired wall, a burial, a boundary, a path. These memories matter when people stay. The land becomes crowded with meaning. Every season adds another layer. The material signs of this new life are often humble but profound. Pottery becomes one of the great archaeological voices of early farming Europe. Clay vessels store, cook, carry, and display. Their forms and decorations can reveal cultural connections across wide areas, though they must be interpreted carefully. A shared style does not always mean a shared people in the modern sense. It may mean exchange, imitation, marriage networks, ritual fashion, or a memory of common origin. Still, pottery spreads ideas in durable form. Its fragments survive where baskets, leather bags, wooden bowls, and woven containers vanish. Because clay endures, it can make ancient people seem more ceramic than they really were. Polished stone axes are another sign of transformation. They are tools, but also symbols of the labour required to make the farming world possible. Forest clearance is not a minor task. Trees must be felled, roots burned or worked around, branches cut for fuel and building material. A single field represents effort repeated over seasons. The axe is therefore not just an object, it is a promise of open space. In some cases, finely made axes may have carried meanings beyond practical use, signalling exchange connections or status. No single explanation fully accounts for every object, but their presence reminds us that the creation of farmland was itself an act of reshaping Europe. Domestic animals alter the sound and movement of settlements. Cattle are especially significant, not only as sources of meat, milk, hide, bone, and traction in later contexts, but as living wealth. They require space and care. They also reproduce, die, wander, sicken, and create disputes. Sheep and goats offer other possibilities. Pigs thrive in certain woodland environments, and dogs remain close companions and helpers. With animals come new forms of dependency. A disease in a herd can threaten a household. A harsh winter can turn abundance into loss. Farming increases control over food, but never gives complete control. There is also an invisible biological cost. Settled communities living with animals, waste, stored grain, and denser populations face new health pressures. Bones can preserve hints of stress, diet, disease, and labour, though they do not tell every story. Toothwear may reveal the grinding of stone particles into flour. Skeletal strain may suggest repeated physical work. Nutritional stress can leave marks during childhood. Farming does not simply improve life in a straight line. In many parts of the world, Early agriculturalists work harder, eat a narrower diet, and suffer new vulnerabilities compared with some foraging groups. This does not mean farming was a mistake. It means it was a bargain with complicated terms. And yet it spreads, because its strengths are real. Fields can feed more people from a given area than hunting and gathering alone in many environments. Stored grain can bridge seasonal shortages. Domestic animals can convert grass, scraps, and woodland resources into usable food. Larger populations can support more craftspeople, more ritual specialists, more exchange, more social memory. Villages become nodes in wider networks. People begin to live in landscapes where the next settlement may be within reach, where marriage partners, tools, ornaments, and stories move along known paths. One surprising detail is that farming Europe was not only about food, it was also about architecture as identity. House forms could be deeply conservative, repeated across generations as if the plan itself carried meaning. To build a house in a familiar shape may have been a way of saying that life continues properly, that ancestors are remembered, that the community remains itself. In some Neolithic traditions, houses appear almost person-like in their importance. They are born, maintained, transformed, and sometimes deliberately ended. Later, in parts of southeastern Europe, the burning of houses becomes one of the strangest and most debated practices in the archaeological record. But even before that mystery fully emerges, the house is already central. As farming moves farther into Europe, it creates differences as much as similarities. In the Balkans and Lower Danube regions, long-lasting settlements can accumulate into tells, mounds formed by repeated building and rebuilding. Farther into Central Europe, other traditions favour longhouses stretched across open ground, along coasts and rivers. Fishing and gathering may remain vital alongside agriculture. In some frontier zones, farmers and foragers exchange goods and perhaps genes, but also maintain distinct ways of life for generations. The map is not a simple wave of progress. It is a shifting borderland of choices. This matters because the lost civilization hidden beneath Europe grows out of this complexity. It is not born overnight. It emerges from the accumulated consequences of farming more people, more permanent houses, more storage, more land clearance, more exchange, more ritual attention to place, more chances for inequality, and more pressure when systems fail. The first farmers do not set out to create a civilization that future archaeologists will struggle to name. They are trying to live. Feed children, honour the dead, survive winters, and make sense of forces larger than themselves. By the time their descendants fill the valleys and plains of southeastern Europe, the continent has already changed. Forests have been opened in patches, paths link settlements, fields return year after year. The smell of smoke and grain becomes part of human geography. The old mobile world does not disappear everywhere, but a new kind of permanence has taken root, and permanence, once established, has a strange power. It gathers people, it gathers memory, it gathers wealth, it gathers risk. Out of those gatherings, Europe's buried old world begins to rise. At first, the village is the whole world, a cluster of houses, a few paths pressed into mud, storage pits, animal pens, hearth smoke, fields nearby, woodland beyond, and the dead resting close enough to remain part of the place. But over generations, in some parts of prehistoric Europe, the village begins to stretch beyond its older limits. Houses multiply, craft traditions become more refined, exchange reaches farther, ritual objects become more distinctive, settlements begin to show planning. repetition, and a kind of social grammar that is difficult to read but impossible to ignore. Something larger than the ordinary village life is forming, though it does not yet resemble the kingdoms and cities that later history teaches us to recognize. This is one of the great challenges in understanding Europe's buried old world. Modern eyes are trained to look for civilization in certain shapes: walls, palaces, writing, kings, armies, temples, monuments of stone. But the Neolithic and Copper Age communities of southeastern and central Europe often express complexity through humbler materials: timber, clay, thatch, plaster, pigment, bone, shell, stone, copper, and gold carry the weight of their world. Much of it decays, much of it burns. Much of it is broken before it reaches us. What survives in the record suggests organization without bureaucracy in the later sense, influence without obvious kingship in many places, and scale without the familiar signatures of state power. A settlement becoming larger is not merely a matter of more houses. Size changes everything. More people mean more food must be produced, stored, shared, defended, or negotiated. More households mean more relationships, obligations, rivalries, marriages, debts, and memories. Paths become more permanent because more feet follow them. Waste accumulates. Animals require management. Fields extend farther from homes. Wood must be gathered from greater distances as nearby stands are cut. Clay must be dug, water carried, tools repaired, and conflicts settled before they tear the community apart. A large settlement is a living machine made of human habits, and it needs constant attention. Archaeologists often see this growth first as pattern. House after house appears in the ground, sometimes aligned, sometimes arranged in repeated plans, sometimes rebuilt on similar footprints. These patterns matter because they suggest that people were not placing homes at random. They were organizing space according to rules, customs, or shared expectations. A house might face a certain way, a pathway might remain open, activity zones might cluster, storage, cooking, craft production, and ritual deposits might occupy particular areas. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how much planning was formal and how much emerged from tradition. But even tradition can be powerful. Repeated habit is one of the oldest forms of order. Inside these settlements, craft becomes increasingly important. Pottery is not only functional, it is shaped, smoothed, painted, incised, burnished, and fired with skill. Some vessels carry geometric designs that seem to move across the surface like woven memory. Others have forms that suggest feasting, storage, pouring, or ritual display. A pot can be made quickly, but a fine pot requires knowledge where to find suitable clay, how to temper it, how to shape the wall, how to control drying, how to fire without cracking, how to create surface effects that mark a community's style. Such knowledge can belong to households, specialists, elders, or lineages. It can be taught, guarded, displayed, and traded. Other crafts deepen the sense of growing complexity. Stone tools require raw material that may come from distant sources. Bone and antler are worked into points, awls, handles, and ornaments. Shells travel inland from seas and rivers, becoming beads or pendants far from their origins. Pigments color bodies, objects, walls, or ritual items. Copper, when it appears, changes the possibilities of prestige and technology. It does not immediately replace stone. Early metal is often rare, valued, and symbolically charged. But once people learn that certain stones can be transformed by heat into gleaming, malleable material, the world of matter itself becomes stranger. Earth can become metal, fire can reveal hidden properties. That knowledge must have seemed both practical and profound. The growth of settlements also changes how people relate to the dead. In smaller communities, burial practices may already bind families to place, but larger societies create more elaborate questions. Who is buried where? Who receives ornaments? Who is excluded? Are some bodies treated differently because of age, sex, status, ancestry, role, or circumstance? Archaeology cannot recover every reason, and no single explanation fully accounts for the variation. But burial evidence can reveal inequality long before written titles appear. A grave with rich goods is not simply a collection of objects. It is a statement made by the living about the dead, and perhaps about themselves. Yet not all communities express status in the same way. Some large settlements leave surprisingly little evidence for sharp hierarchy, while cemeteries elsewhere reveal astonishing wealth differences. This unevenness is important. It warns against imagining one simple ladder of progress from village to chiefdom to state. Europe's buried old world experiments with many forms of social life. Some communities may have valued household autonomy. Others may have developed influential ritual figures. Craft specialists, elders, lineage heads, or emerging elites. Power might be temporary, situational, negotiated, or hidden within ceremonies rather than displayed as permanent rule. The absence of palaces does not mean the absence of authority. It means authority may have worn different clothes. The environment around these settlements is also being remade. Fields spread into cleared woodland, domestic animals graze in managed spaces, paths link homes to water, fields, pasture, clay sources, and neighbouring communities. A settlement is not just the houses visible in excavation. It includes an entire surrounding territory of work and memory. People know which grove provides good timber, which patch floods in spring, which slope catches sun, which path is safe in winter, which stream gives clay after rain. This knowledge is rarely visible in artifacts, but it underlies every act of settlement growth. One lesser-known detail is how much prehistoric settlement life may have depended on maintenance. Modern ruins often make ancient buildings seem static, but clay and timber architecture demands constant repair. Walls crack, roofs leak, floors wear down, smoke blackens interiors, rodents enter storage areas, posts rot. A house must be cared for almost like a living thing. This regular repair creates continuity, but also labour. The more houses a settlement has, the more maintenance becomes part of communal existence. Civilization is not only built in moments of grand creation, it is preserved through repeated, ordinary work. As villages become something larger, their relationship with time changes. A small seasonal camp may be remembered through stories and return visits, but a large settlement accumulates physical layers. Floors are renewed, hearths shift, pits are filled, broken pots become part of the ground, new houses rise beside or over old ones, children grow up surrounded by traces of previous lives, the past becomes literally underfoot. In some places, this accumulation forms mounds, telling anyone who approaches that people have lived there for a long time. A mound is not only geology, it is memory made visible. Still, larger settlements are fragile in new ways. Their success creates pressures. More people require more land. More land clearance can reduce nearby woodland. More animals can strain pasture. More storage can attract theft or conflict. More social complexity can create resentment. More permanent houses make abandonment harder. Once a community has invested generations into one place, leaving is not just movement, it is loss. The very permanence that gives these settlements strength also ties them to risks they cannot fully control. This tension is at the heart of Europe's hidden civilization. It rises not because people suddenly invent grandeur, but because ordinary decisions accumulate into extraordinary scale. Build one house, then another. Clear one field, then another. Exchange one ornament, then another. Teach one child a craft, then another. Bury one ancestor, then another. Over centuries. These acts create worlds dense enough to leave deep archaeological shadows. No king needs to command the process. No written law needs to announce it. Society can become complex by growing around habits that prove useful, meaningful, and difficult to abandon. By the time the great cultural networks of southeastern Europe flourish, the old image of scattered simple villages no longer fits. Some communities are becoming centres of production, ritual, exchange, and identity. Their people live in landscapes marked by ancestors, fields, paths, and materials drawn from near and far. Their houses stand in ordered relation to one another. Their objects carry shared styles. Their dead sometimes reveal difference. Their technologies reach into clay, stone, bone, shell, and metal. They are not yet states, and they are not cities in every sense of the word, but they are no longer merely small farming hamlets either. The buried old world is beginning to show its shape. It is a civilization without a single capital, a network without a map, a memory without writing. Its power lies not in monuments towering above the earth, but in traces spread through it, settlement plans, burned walls, patterned pots, ornaments, tools, graves, and the quiet insistence of repeated human presence. Europe's first farmers have become something more than newcomers with seeds. They have become builders of enduring places, and from those places the hidden continent begins to connect. The rivers of Europe are older than its histories, and long before roads, borders, and written maps, they serve as the continent's first great corridors. They carry water, fish, silt, reeds, timber, clay, boats, stories, strangers, ornaments, and ideas. Among them, the Danube is not simply a river, it is a vast moving spine, rising in the west and flowing toward the Black Sea, crossing and connecting landscapes that might otherwise remain separated by forest, mountain, marsh, and distance. To the people of Europe's buried old world, the Danube and its tributaries are not lines on a map, they are living routes through the continent. The settlements that grow around this watery network benefit from more than fertile soil. River valleys gather resources in layers. Floodplains offer rich land for cultivation, though they also bring the danger of unpredictable water. Wetlands provide reeds, birds, fish, shellfish, and seasonal grazing. River banks expose clay for pottery and house plaster. Timber grows in nearby woodland. Animals come to drink, and humans follow. A river can feed a community, but it can also connect one community to another. In a world without wheeled highways, the difference between isolation and exchange may be a navigable current, a ford, or a familiar valley path running beside the water. The Danube's importance lies partly in its geography. It links Central Europe with the Balkans and the Black Sea world, drawing together zones of farming, herding, metal resources, salt sources, and cultural exchange. Its tributaries branch into smaller landscapes, reaching settlements that may never stand directly on the main river, but still belong to its wider system. Through these corridors, materials move in ways that surprise modern observers. A shell ornament found far inland may speak of distant coasts. A stone tool may reveal a source many days away. Copper and gold may travel from mountains and river gravels into graves and households, far from where the raw material first glittered in the earth. This does not mean there is a Danubian empire. There is no evidence for a single ruling power controlling the whole system. No river king whose name survives, no central palace directing exchange. What survives in the record suggests something subtler and more human overlapping networks of contact. Families marry across distance. Craftspeople learn styles from neighbouring regions. Traders, visitors, migrants, or seasonal travellers carry objects and techniques. Ritual ideas may move with people or be imitated after brief encounters. A decorated pot form can spread without conquest. A copper object can pass through many hands before it reaches its final owner. The river makes all of this easier. Along the Danube and its surrounding regions, prehistoric Europe becomes a place of meeting. Farming communities spreading from the southeastern counter established local groups and varied environments. Some settlements become long-lived, accumulating layers of occupation. Others appear, flourish briefly, and vanish. The river system allows both continuity and movement, and this combination is powerful. A community can be rooted in one place while still connected to faraway others. It can belong to a local landscape and a wider world at the same time. The human experience of such a river world would be intensely seasonal. In spring, water rises, paths soften, fields demand attention, animals give birth, and fish may become abundant. In summer, crops ripen, clay dries more predictably. Travel may become easier in some places and harder in others as heat lowers water or turns wetlands foul. In autumn, harvests are stored, animals are selected for winter survival, and exchange may intensify as communities prepare for scarcity. In winter, movement contracts, stories lengthen, and the river can become both barrier and road, depending on ice, weather, and local conditions. Archaeology preserves objects, but behind those objects is a calendar of labour. The Danube's secret network is also a network of visibility. Rivers guide the eye. A settlement placed near a bend, terrace, ford, or confluence can be seen by those passing through. Such places may become gathering points not because someone decrees them important, but because geography repeatedly brings people there. Confluences in particular can matter deeply. Where waters meet, routes meet, goods can be exchanged, news carried, marriages arranged, conflicts negotiated, rituals performed. The evidence remains incomplete, but settlement patterns often remind us that prehistoric people chose places with practical and symbolic awareness. A good site is rarely good for only one reason. In southeastern Europe, river corridors help explain why certain cultural traditions spread and interact so richly. The Starchevo, Kuros, Krish, Vincha, Gumelnica, Kukuteni Tripilia, and related worlds cannot be reduced to the Danube alone, but many of their landscapes are shaped by its larger basin and neighbouring river systems. These names are modern archaeological labels, not the names people called themselves. They are useful, but they can create artificial boundaries in life. The borders between cultural worlds may have been porous, shifting, and understood through kinship, place, language, ritual, and exchange in ways we can only partially reconstruct. One surprising detail is that the river network may have connected not only prosperous centres, but also zones of tension. Rivers can unite, but they can also attract competition. Fertile floodplains are valuable, salt routes are valuable, Access to copper-bearing regions is valuable. A ford or crossing point can matter. A settlement placed near a resource may become influential, envied, or vulnerable. No single explanation fully accounts for patterns of conflict or cooperation in this period. But the growth of networks does not imply peaceful harmony. Exchange and rivalry often travel together. The same route that brings ornaments can bring enemies, disease, or pressure. The Danube also shapes the imagination of permanence. A field may fail, a house may burn, a settlement may be abandoned, but the river remains. It gives a sense of continuity larger than any one community. People living near it likely know stories of floods, dangerous crossings, drowned animals, rich fishing places, old camps, ancestral paths, and strange objects found in mud. Rivers hold memory differently from settlements. They move and endure at once. Their banks shift, but their presence remains. For people without written maps, the river itself is a guide, a boundary, a provider, and perhaps a sacred force. As settlements grow, riverine exchange helps create differences between communities. Some places gain access to rare materials and become nodes in broader networks. Others remain more local. A craftsperson with the right connections can obtain better stone, brighter pigment, shells from distant waters, or metal from specialized sources. Such access may affect status. It may also affect ritual. Objects that come from far away often carry power beyond their material function. A shell is not merely calcium carbonate shaped into a bead. It is the sea carried inland. A copper axe is not merely a tool. It is transformed earth, fire made solid, a thing that links its owner to hidden places in mountains or river gravels. Yet the network is not only about prestige goods. More ordinary things move to seeds, animals, techniques, spouses, songs, recipes, decorative habits, house-building knowledge, and warnings. A community that hears of crop failure downstream may prepare differently. A group that learns of a new pottery style may adapt it. A marriage across settlements can bind exchange partners for generations. In this sense, the Danube world is not a trade network in the later commercial sense only. It is a social bloodstream. The buried evidence of this connectivity can be frustratingly uneven. Organic boats may vanish, spoken languages vanish, personal relationships vanish. The memory of a journey disappears unless it leaves an object behind. Archaeologists must infer movement from the distribution of materials and styles, from isotopes in human or animal remains, from settlement placement, from the presence of non-local goods. Scholars still debate many of these patterns because similar evidence can support more than one story. A distant object might mean direct travel, down-the-line exchange, migration, gift-giving, or imitation. The ground gives clues, not full confessions. Still, the broad picture is clear enough. Prehistoric Europe is connected earlier and more deeply than older narratives once assumed. The people of these river worlds are not isolated farmers trapped in small clearings. They are part of a shifting web that carries matter and meaning across hundreds of kilometers. Their settlements may be made of clay and timber, but their horizons are wider than the village boundary. They know roots. They know other communities. They know that some things come from beyond the familiar hills. This network prepares the ground for the remarkable cultures that will soon dominate the story. Without the rivers, the rise of old Europe is difficult to imagine. The Danube and its tributaries help move crops, animals, materials, skills, and symbolic habits through the continent's southeastern heart. They turn scattered settlements into communicating worlds. They allow local experiments to become regional traditions. They make it possible for gold from one place, copper from another, pottery styles from another, and ritual ideas from still another to meet in the same human landscape. Under the modern bridges and cities of the Danube basin, beneath the floodplains and terraces, beneath fields that still depend on old soils, lies the memory of this first hidden network. It did not need written contracts or imperial roads. It flowed through kinship, exchange, habit, and water. The river carried more than boats. It carried the possibility that Europe's villages could become part of something larger than themselves. Out of the river corridors, fertile plains, forest edges, salt routes, copper zones, and village traditions, a remarkable prehistoric world begins to take shape. Archaeologists sometimes call parts of it Old Europe, a useful phrase if handled with care. It does not mean a single country. It does not mean one language, one ruler, or one people marching under one symbol. It means a broad and varied constellation of Neolithic and Copper Age societies across southeastern and eastern Europe, linked by farming, settlement, craft, ritual, exchange, and shared transformations that make the continent's deep past far richer than the old image of scattered primitive villages. This old Europe is not easy to see from above. It has no imperial border. It leaves no written constitution. Its cities, if that word can be used at all, are not built of stone towers, but in the ground, its presence is unmistakable. In the Balkans, the Vinča world spreads through dense settlements and distinctive material culture. Near the Black Sea, the Varna cemetery reveals gold, copper, shell, and social differences on a startling scale. Across the forest steppe of what is now Moldova, Romania, and Ukraine, the Cucuteni Tripelia culture creates settlements of extraordinary size and strange regularity. Around them are related cultures, neighbours, influences, and local traditions, each adding another layer to the buried continent. The Vinča culture, flourishing in the central Balkans from the late 6th into the 5th millennium BC, offers one of the clearest glimpses of this early complexity. Its settlements are often carefully organised, with houses built close together, sometimes in repeated plans. Its people make pottery, figurines, tools, ornaments, and clay objects marked with signs that have provoked long debate. The Vinča world is also tied to early metallurgy, though scholars still debate how exactly metal production spread and how widely it affected daily life. What survives suggests a society capable of long-lived settlement, skilled craft, and symbolic habits that were neither random nor simple. A Vinča settlement would have felt dense, smoky, and alive. Houses of timber and clay stand near one another, hearths burn, potters shape vessels with practiced hands, animals move at the edges of habitation, children learn by watching. Some objects are made for use, others for display, others perhaps for ritual purposes that cannot be fully recovered. Figurines appear in large numbers, often with stylized bodies and faces that seem both human and distant. It is tempting to assign them one meaning, to call them goddesses, ancestors, toys, charms, or teaching objects. But no single explanation fully accounts for the variety. Their power lies partly in their ambiguity. They show that people were making images of bodies, identities, and perhaps forces beyond ordinary sight. Farther east, the Cucuteni Tripelia world expands across an enormous area. It is famous for painted pottery, clay figurines, house models, and settlements that grow far beyond the scale of ordinary villages. Some of these settlements are arranged in great rings or ovals, with hundreds or even thousands of structures. Their size has led to intense debate. Were they permanent urban centres, seasonal gathering places, ritual landscapes, or something between those categories? The evidence remains incomplete. Population estimates vary. Not every house may have been occupied at the same time. Yet even cautious interpretations reveal a social achievement of impressive scale. People were organising space, labour, and community memory across landscapes large enough to challenge simple definitions. The Cucuteni Tripilia houses add one of the strangest details in all of prehistoric Europe. Many were deliberately burned. These were not always accidental fires. Some structures were burned so intensely that clay walls and floors hardened into masses of fired material. Archaeologists have long debated why. Perhaps burning marked the end of a house's life, a ritual closing, a renewal practice, a response to infestation, a method of rebuilding, or some combination of practical and symbolic reasons. What survives in the record suggests that houses were more than shelters. They may have had biographies. They could be born, inhabited, maintained, and ritually ended, in a world where the house anchored family, ancestry, and identity. Burning it may have been an act heavy with meaning. To the southeast, around the western Black Sea, another astonishing sign appears: the Varna Cemetery. Here, some graves contain extraordinary wealth, including some of the earliest known gold objects in the world. The amount and distribution of grave goods reveal striking inequality. Some individuals are buried with rich ornaments, copper tools, shell, and symbolic objects, while other graves are modest or even contain no body at all, only offerings. This is not a small detail. It suggests that status, ritual authority, or social differentiation had reached a level that older models of egalitarian farming villages could not easily explain. Scholars still debate the exact nature of this hierarchy, but the cemetery makes one thing clear: by the 5th millennium BC, parts of Europe already know wealth, display, and difference. The surprising part is that these societies do not develop into familiar early states. There is no clear palace system, no royal inscriptions, no tax tablets, no armies recorded by scribes. Their complexity takes another form. They can produce wealth without kings we can name. They can build large settlements without leaving obvious bureaucracies. They can exchange over long distances without coinage. They can create symbols without writing histories. They can be socially ranked without becoming empires. This makes them difficult to categorize, but it also makes them important. They force us to loosen the definition of civilization. Old Europe is not primitive because it lacks the features of later states. It is different. Its social power may have been rooted in households, kin groups, ritual specialists, craft knowledge, exchange control, ancestral places, or seasonal gatherings. Its authority may have been distributed rather than centralized. Its monuments may have been houses, graves, cemeteries, settlement plans, and repeated acts rather than stone pyramids. Its memory may have been carried through objects, ceremonies, and landscapes instead of written archives. The absence of writing does not mean the absence of history. It means the history was lived and transmitted in ways that are harder for us to recover. One lesser-known detail is how colourful this world may have been. Prehistoric Europe is often imagined in dull earth tones because excavated remains are faded and broken. But painted pottery, pigments, polished surfaces, shell ornaments, copper gleam, gold shine, woven textiles, decorated bodies, and bright fires would have created a far more vivid environment. Clothing almost never survives. but it surely existed in varied forms: hair, skin, fabric, leather, beads. And paint may have carried signs of age, status, ritual role, family identity, or regional belonging. The world beneath Europe was not grey. Time made it grey. Still, beauty and complexity do not mean peace or perfection. Large settlements bring disease risk, waste, tension, and dependence on harvests. Inequality can create resentment. Long-distance exchange can fail. Ritual systems can lose authority. The evidence for violence varies by region and period, and scholars still debate how widespread conflict was within Old Europe. But any society with valuable goods, stored food, land claims, and social ranking has the ingredients for friction. The buried record may hide many disputes that never left marks on bone or settlement walls. What makes Old Europe so haunting is that it stands at a crossroads of possibility. It shows a path of complexity that might have continued in many directions. Perhaps some communities could have become more urban. Perhaps others might have remained large but non-state societies. Perhaps the settlement networks might have reorganized into new forms if environmental and social pressures had been different. But the past does not unfold from potential alone. It is shaped by climate, migration, resources, disease, conflict, and choices made under pressure. For centuries, these cultures flourish and transform the continent's southeastern heart. They work copper and gold. They build villages and mega-sites. They make figurines whose faces still refuse explanation. They paint vessels with swirling designs. They trade materials across great distances. They bury some dead with wealth and others with little. They live inside a world of houses that may be remembered almost as beings. They belong to Europe before Europe has a name. Then, gradually and unevenly, the picture begins to change. Some traditions fade. Some settlements are abandoned. Some networks weaken. New customs appear. The buried old world does not vanish in one night, but its shape does not last forever. Before that transformation can be understood, however, one of its most dazzling clues must be examined more closely: a cemetery near the Black Sea, where the dead carried gold before the pharaohs, and where Europe's hidden civilization revealed that even in deep prehistory, human society had already learned how to make inequality shine. Near the western shore of the Black Sea, close to the modern city of Varna in Bulgaria, the ground once opened onto one of the most astonishing discoveries in European prehistory. It was not a palace. It was not a fortress. It was not a temple rising above the land. It was a cemetery, and in its graves lay a truth that seemed at first almost out-of-place gold, worked with care, buried with the dead more than 6,000 years ago, before the pyramids of Egypt, before the first cities of Mesopotamia reached their full historic power, before bronze became the metal of warriors and kings. People in southeastern Europe were already transforming bright metal into symbols of status, ritual, and perhaps authority. The Varna cemetery is startling because it forces the hidden world beneath Europe into sudden brilliance. Much of this civilization survives as dark soil stains, broken pottery, burned clay, and the faint plans of vanished houses. But gold does not fade in the same way. It waits. It keeps its colour while wood rots, cloth disappears, and names are lost. When archaeologists uncovered the graves at Varna, they found ornaments, beads, appliques, bracelets, tools, copper objects, shells, and symbolic arrangements that suggested not a simple farming village, but a society capable of producing wealth and assigning it unevenly among its dead. The unevenness is the key. Some graves are modest, Some are rich, a few are extraordinary. One burial in particular contained a concentration of gold so remarkable that it became one of the most famous prehistoric graves in Europe. The person buried there was accompanied by hundreds of gold objects, along with copper tools and other high-status goods. Whether this individual was a ruler, ritual specialist, lineage leader, warrior figure, or someone whose importance combined several roles remains debated. The evidence remains incomplete, because the grave goods speak clearly about difference, but not clearly about titles. Still, the message is impossible to ignore. Some people in this society were treated in death as dramatically different from others. That matters because social inequality is one of the deepest turning points in human history. In small mobile groups, status can exist, but wealth is harder to accumulate permanently. In settled farming communities, storage, land, livestock, craft production, and exchange all create new opportunities for difference. One household may control more cattle, another may have better access to copper, another may hold ritual knowledge, another may inherit obligations and prestige through ancestry. Over time, differences that begin as practical advantages can become social facts. They can be displayed in clothing, houses, feasts, tools, ornaments, and eventually graves. Varna shows that by the 5th millennium BC, this process had already gone very far in at least one corner of Europe. The gold itself probably came from local or regional sources, perhaps river deposits where tiny particles of metal could be collected with great patience. But finding gold is only the beginning. It must be recognized as special, gathered, worked, shaped, perforated, polished, and turned into objects whose value is understood by others. Gold is not useful in the way a sharp flint blade or a strong wooden handle is useful. It is soft. It does not make the best cutting edge. Its power lies in appearance, rarity, durability, and social meaning. It shines like sunlight captured in matter. It resists decay. It can be carried on the body or placed beside the dead as if brightness itself could follow them into another state. This is one of the lesser-known surprises of early metallurgy. Metals do not become important only because they are practical. They first enter human life as wonders. Copper, gold, and other materials are part of a changing understanding of the earth. Stone is no longer merely stone. Some stones bleed colour, some melt, some become metal under heat. Fire reveals hidden qualities in the world. A person who knows how to find ore, smelt copper, hammer gold, or anneal metal possesses knowledge that may seem technical to us, but could have carried ritual weight in prehistoric society. Metallurgy is chemistry, but it is also transformation, and transformation is rarely spiritually neutral in ancient worlds. Varna's wealth also points toward long-distance connection. Alongside gold and copper, marine shells and other materials show that the cemetery belongs to a world of exchange reaching beyond a single settlement. The Black Sea coast, river routes, inland plains, and upland resource zones all form part of the wider system. Objects move, people move, ideas move. A cemetery like Varna is therefore not only a place of burial, it is a place where networks become visible. The dead are laid into the earth with materials gathered from different landscapes, as if the social identity of a person could be assembled from the wider world. Some graves at Varna are even stranger because they are symbolic rather than ordinary burials. Certain graves contain rich goods but no human body, or only symbolic arrangements. These are sometimes called cenotaphs, though that modern word may not capture their original meaning. Were they memorials for absent dead ritual deposits for ancestors, deities, or social roles, Were they ceremonies without bodies, or bodies that did not survive under certain conditions? Scholars still debate these questions. What survives in the record suggests that burial was not merely disposal of the dead. It was a structured act, a public statement, perhaps a negotiation between the living, the ancestors, and powers beyond ordinary life. The presence of rich graves raises another difficult issue. Was this the beginning of kingship in Europe? The answer must be careful. Varna reveals hierarchy, but hierarchy is not automatically monarchy. A person can be immensely important without being a king. Authority can be ritual, economic, ancestral, or situational. It can rest in a lineage rather than a single office. It can be recognized at death more dramatically than it was exercised in life. No inscription tells us that the richest individual ruled a territory. No palace confirms an administrative centre. No army is recorded. The cemetery gives evidence of ranked society, not a full political constitution. Still, it shows that inequality had become visible, formalized, and perhaps inherited or institutionalized in some way. That visibility would have changed life among the living. Imagine a community where certain people wear ornaments made from rare materials, where copper tools signal access to specialized production, where shells from distant waters hang on bodies far inland, where gold gleams during ceremonies in firelight. Such display is not passive. It teaches everyone who sees it that difference exists. It makes status memorable. It may inspire loyalty, envy, or resentment, imitation, or fear. Wealth is never only material. It organizes attention. The cemetery also reminds us that the dead can be used by the living. A rich burial may honor a powerful person, but it may also strengthen the claims of those who remain. By placing wealth in a grave, a community removes it from circulation, which seems economically wasteful if value is measured only in practical terms. But ritual value works differently. To bury gold is to make a statement that cannot easily be undone. It says that the person, lineage, role, or ceremony matters more than keeping every object in daily use. It turns wealth into memory. It makes the grave a fixed point in the social landscape. Yet Varna's brilliance stands against a wider uncertainty. Why does such wealth appear here, in this form, at this time? Why does it not lead directly into a long chain of early European kingdoms? Why does this dazzling social experiment seem to fade rather than expand into a written civilization? No single explanation fully accounts for this. The society around Varna may have depended on exchange networks that later weakened. Environmental changes may have shifted settlement patterns. Social tensions may have grown. New movements of people and new forms of power may have changed what mattered. The cemetery captures a peak, but peaks can be fragile. There is a quiet tragedy in the fact that gold preserves status better than it preserves identity. The richest dead of Varna are famous now, but not by name. Their ornaments survive, their voices do not. Their power is visible, their thoughts are gone. We can measure objects, compare graves, analyze materials, and map networks. But we cannot hear the songs sung at burial, know the grief of those present, or understand exactly what the shining metal meant to them. The evidence is magnificent. And still it is partial. Even so, Varna changes the way Europe's deep past must be imagined. It proves that by the 5th millennium BC, communities around the Black Sea were not merely surviving. They were creating symbols of wealth, difference, and perhaps sacred authority with a sophistication that still unsettles older assumptions. Civilization here did not need stone pyramids to make hierarchy visible. It needed graves, ceremonies, rare materials, and a shared belief that some lives, or some deaths, should be marked with extraordinary brightness. The gold before the pharaohs is therefore more than treasure. It is a warning against underestimating worlds without writing. Beneath Europe, long before its classical civilizations, people had already learned to turn the earth's hidden metals into social power. They had learned that shine could speak. They had learned that the dead could carry messages for the living, and in the dark soil near the Black Sea, they left a message bright enough to survive 6,000 years, even after the civilization that made it had fallen silent. If Varna gives Europe's buried old world its gold, the clay signs give it its silence. They appear on tablets, figurines, vessels, spindle whorls, seals, and small objects shaped by human hands, scratched or impressed into surfaces before firing, preserved because clay has a stubborn memory. Some marks are simple strokes, others form crosses, chevrons, grids, V-shapes, lines, comb-like patterns, or repeated symbols arranged with care. They are most famously associated with the Vinča cultural world and related Neolithic societies of southeastern Europe, though similar debates surround marks across several regions. They are small, often easy to overlook, and yet they have provoked one of the most persistent questions in European prehistory: were these people beginning to write? The temptation is understandable. Writing is one of the great thresholds by which later civilizations announce themselves. Once people record names, accounts, laws, offerings, myths, or transactions, their societies become easier for us to hear. The silence breaks. So when signs appear in Europe centuries before the earliest widely accepted writing systems of Mesopotamia, it is almost impossible not to lean forward. Could this hidden civilization have developed a lost script? Could Europe have had writing earlier than expected? Could those little marks be the voice of a world that history forgot? The careful answer is more restrained and more interesting. Scholars still debate what the signs represent, but most do not treat them as a fully demonstrated writing system in the strict sense. The evidence remains incomplete. The inscriptions are usually short. There are no long texts, no bilingual keys, no clear administrative archives, no repeated sentences whose structure can be analysed in the way early cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphic records can be studied. Many signs may be ownership marks, potter's marks, ritual symbols, numerical notations, clan signs, decorative motifs, mnemonic devices, or elements of a symbolic system that carried meaning without encoding spoken language directly. That distinction matters. A symbol can be meaningful without being writing. Yet the fact that they may not be writing does not make them unimportant. In some ways, it makes them more mysterious. These marks show that people were organizing meaning visually, repeating signs, placing them on objects, and perhaps using them in social or ritual contexts. A mark on a pot might identify its maker, owner, contents, destination, or role in ceremony. A sign on a figurine might refer to gender, status, transformation, protection, ancestry, or something we do not have words for. A sequence of marks might help memory, count items, mark participation, or signal belonging. What survives in the record suggests a world where meaning did not depend only on speech. It could be carried by objects. The Vinča signs are especially haunting because they sit at the edge of recognition. They look intentional. They look controlled. They look as if they should be readable. But looking like writing is not the same as being writing. Modern people are surrounded by scripts, logos, numbers, labels, and icons. So the mind quickly turns repeated marks into language. Archaeology must resist that impatience. To call the signs a lost alphabet would be dramatic, but unsupported. To dismiss them as random scratches would be equally careless. They belong somewhere between decoration and writing, in a broad human territory of symbol-making that predates and surrounds formal scripts. This symbolic world includes figurines, and the figurines complicate everything. Across old Europe, thousands of small clay figures have been found. Many are human-like, often stylized, sometimes seated, standing, masked, elongated, or strangely abstract. Some show exaggerated hips or torsos. Others have bird-like faces, triangular heads, incised patterns, or carefully shaped postures. Earlier interpretations often called them mother goddesses, imagining a peaceful prehistoric Europe centered on fertility worship. That idea became popular, and in some circles it remains emotionally powerful. But mainstream scholarship is more cautious. Fertility may have been one meaning for some objects, but no single explanation fully accounts for the variety, contexts, and uses of these figures. A figurine might be a ritual object, ancestor image, teaching tool, charm, toy, representation of a social identity, or temporary participant in a ceremony. Some are found broken, which may suggest deliberate fragmentation, ordinary damage, or complex ritual lives. Some appear in houses, pits, or special deposits. Their contexts vary, and context is everything. A figure found near a hearth may not mean the same thing as one placed in a pit, or associated with other unusual objects. The evidence remains incomplete, but the repetition of human form shows that bodies themselves were symbolic landscapes. People were thinking with bodies, shaping clay into forms that condensed ideas about life, death, gender, age, power, transformation, and belonging. There is a lesser-known detail about these signs and figurines that deserves attention. Many were handled at human scale. They were not distant monuments. They fit in hands. They could be turned, carried, placed, hidden, exchanged, broken, or buried. Their meanings may have depended on touch as much as sight. A clay tablet with marks is not only something to be seen, it is something held. A figurine's surface may preserve the pressure of fingers from 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. This intimacy matters. Old Europe's symbolic world was not only displayed in grand public spaces, it lived in the closeness of houses, hearths, storage areas, workspaces, and ritual deposits. The smallness of the objects may also explain why they survived so well, and why their meanings are so difficult to reconstruct. Large monuments force later generations to respond to them. Small objects can disappear into daily life. They may be meaningful to those who use them without requiring explanation to outsiders. A symbol scratched on clay might be obvious within a community and opaque everywhere else. Without the living tradition, the sign becomes a shape. Archaeologists can count it, map it, compare it, and analyze its placement, but meaning slips away. Still, patterns emerge. Some signs recur across sites. Some objects seem marked before firing, which means the signs were part of the object's intended life, not later accidents. Some marks are placed in deliberate positions. These details suggest convention. Convention is a powerful thing. It means that at least some people shared an understanding of how marks should be made and where they belonged. Whether that understanding encoded names, numbers, rituals, ownership, or identity remains debated, but it points to a society comfortable with abstract communication. The debate over writing also reveals a deeper problem in how civilizations are judged. If the signs were writing, Old Europe would suddenly seem more advanced to many people. If they were not, it might be pushed back into the category of the merely prehistoric. But this says more about modern assumptions than ancient reality. A society does not become meaningful only when it writes. Human communities can organize memory through song, ritual, genealogy, landscape, repeated house plans. Burial customs, body decoration, object styles, and seasonal gatherings. Writing is powerful, but it is not the only technology of memory. In fact, the absence of the long text may tell us something important. Old Europe's societies may not have needed writing in the way early states did. Writing often grows with administration counting grain, tracking labour, recording tribute, naming rulers, managing temples, controlling surplus. If many old European communities were complex but not state-like, if authority was distributed through households, kinship, ritual, and exchange rather than centralized bureaucracy, then symbolic marks may have been enough. They may have carried the meanings their world required without becoming a full script. This is not failure. It is a different path. Of course, uncertainty remains. Some researchers argue that the sign systems are more structured than skeptics admit. Others argue that the sample is too limited and varied to support claims of writing. The truth may lie in a middle ground, a symbolic tradition with some standardized elements, perhaps moving toward notation in certain contexts, but not yet, or not ever, a script that records speech. The surviving evidence cannot settle every question. Clay preserves marks, but not the rules that made them meaningful. There is also the problem of time. Symbols may change over generations. A mark that begins as a household sign could become ritual. A motif that begins as decoration could acquire identity. A practical notation could become sacred through repeated use. In oral societies, meanings are not fixed in dictionaries. They live in performance and memory. A sign may mean different things in different hands. The archaeological record freezes objects after their use, but not the shifting meanings they carried while alive. So the signs without voices remain among the most tantalizing clues beneath Europe. They do not let us read the thoughts of old Europe, but they show us that thought was being externalized, patterned, and placed into material form. They reveal a world alive with marks, bodies, gestures, and coded surfaces. They remind us that silence is not emptiness. The people who made these signs were not mute. They spoke, sang, named, taught, argued, prayed, mourned, and remembered. It is only that their speech did not cross the millennia in a form we can easily decode. The clay signs sit between the gold of Varna and the vast settlements still to come. They show another kind of richness, not the richness of metal, but of meaning. A small mark on a fired object may not glitter, yet it can be just as powerful because it points toward an invisible world of shared understanding. Somewhere in those strokes and cuts are identities, rituals, practical habits, and perhaps ideas that no longer have names. They are the near words of a civilization that almost speaks. And as the story moves from symbols into scale, from handheld objects to entire landscapes of houses, the same challenge returns in a larger form. Old Europe keeps offering evidence that seems familiar and strange at once, marks that look almost like writing, villages that look almost like cities, burned houses that look almost like destruction, but may have been renewal everywhere. The buried world refuses simple categories. It asks to be understood on its own terms. Through the traces it left in clay, fire, and earth, far out on the forest steppe, across parts of what are now Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, the hidden civilization beneath Europe reaches one of its strangest and most ambitious forms. Here, the Cucuteni Trapilia world builds settlements so large that they disturb the categories normally used for prehistory. From the air and through geophysical survey, some appear as enormous rings and ovals of houses, arranged in patterns that look planned, deliberate, almost urban. They spread across hundreds of hectares. They contain hundreds, sometimes thousands of structures. They are older than many famous cities of the ancient Near East, and yet they do not fit comfortably into the idea of a city at all. This is the puzzle. A city is not just a large settlement. It is usually tied to density, specialization, administration, hierarchy, permanent occupation, and a relationship with surrounding hinterlands. In Mesopotamia, early cities eventually leave temples, tablets, seals, administrative devices, and dense urban layers. Tripilia megasites leave something different: house plans, pottery, figurines, pits, burned structures, open spaces, and huge layouts that suggest organization without the same kind of bureaucracy. Scholars still debate whether these places should be called cities, proto-cities, megasites, aggregation centers, seasonal gathering places, or something else entirely. The evidence remains incomplete, and the terms matter because each one carries a different story about how complex society can form. Imagine approaching one of these places when it is alive. The land opens into a settlement larger than any ordinary village, a spread of houses curving in broad circuits across the plain. Smoke rises from many hearths. Paths follow the arcs of dwellings. Open spaces interrupt the pattern, perhaps for animals, gatherings, work, or ritual. Beyond the outer houses lie fields, pasture, woodland, water sources, and routes connecting the site to smaller settlements. The scale alone would have been impressive, even if not every house was occupied at once. Even if population estimates must be cautious, the act of creating and maintaining such a place required shared expectations, labour coordination, and a powerful sense of order. The houses themselves are central to the mystery. Many were built from timber frames, wattle, daub, and clay, sometimes with multiple rooms, raised floors, ovens, storage areas, and carefully prepared surfaces. Some may have had upper stories or loft spaces, though reconstructions vary. They were not crude shelters. They were substantial domestic spaces, suited to a settled farming world with craft, storage, and ritual life woven into daily routines. Their repetition across the settlement suggests that people shared ideas about what a house should be, how it should face, how it should be repaired, and perhaps how it should end. And many of them ended in fire. This detail cannot be avoided because it is one of the defining features of the Cucuteni Tripilia record. Burned house remains are so common, and some fires so intense, that accidental destruction alone does not seem sufficient. In some cases, burning appears deliberate, perhaps carried out when a house reached the end of its use life. The clay walls, once part of living architecture, hardened in the flames and collapsed into fired masses that preserve the shape of destruction with extraordinary clarity. What looks at first like catastrophe may, in many cases, have been ritual closure, but no single explanation fully accounts for every burned structure. Some fires may have been accidents, some may have followed conflict, some may have been practical efforts to clear old buildings, some may have been ceremonies of renewal, memory, or release. There is something deeply human about a house that must be ended properly. In modern terms, a house is property. In many ancient societies, it may be more than that. It can hold ancestors, births, meals, quarrels, repairs, stored grain, sleeping bodies, tools, and the repeated smoke of years. It can become almost a member of the community. To burn such a house might not mean to erase it. It might mean to transform it. Fire turns the soft clay of walls into something more permanent, preserving the house in ruin even as it destroys it in life. The people who lit those fires could not have known. Archaeologists would study the remains thousands of years later, but they may have known that fire changed the status of the building. It made an ending visible. The layout of the megasites deepens the sense of deliberate design. Some are arranged in concentric circuits, with houses placed along curved lines and open spaces at the center or between rings. Such planning raises difficult questions. Who decided where houses went? Was there a council, elders, ritual authorities, household agreements, inherited rules, or a shared template reproduced through tradition? Did newcomers join, according to kin groups or neighborhood clusters? Were certain zones reserved for special activities? The archaeology provides hints but not a full constitution. What survives in the record suggests social coordination on a remarkable scale, but not necessarily centralized rule in the later state sense. One lesser known and important point is that these megasites may not have been continuously occupied by maximum populations for long periods. Some researchers propose that occupation shifted within them, with houses built, used, burned, and replaced over time. Others suggest that some large sites functioned partly as aggregation centers, drawing people together periodically from a wider region. This would change how we imagine them. Instead of dense permanent cities packed with residents every day of the year, they might have been vast social theatres where dispersed communities gathered, exchanged goods, arranged marriages, held ceremonies, settled disputes, and renewed a shared identity. Yet even this interpretation does not make them less impressive. A place that can gather thousands is still a centre of power, even if that power is seasonal or ritual rather than bureaucratic. The pottery of the Cucuteni Tripilia world adds another layer. Painted vessels carry spirals, curves, bands, and geometric patterns that seem to flow around their forms. Some designs are so controlled and visually striking that they feel almost like motion captured in clay. These pots are not merely containers. They belong to a symbolic and aesthetic world, one where domestic life and meaning are intertwined. Food storage, cooking, serving, feasting, and ritual may all pass through pottery. A vessel can sit in a house, move between households, break in use, or be deposited in a pit. Its decoration may communicate identity, tradition, skill, or ceremonial importance. Figurines and miniature house models also appear, and they are especially intriguing in a culture where the house itself seems so important. A model house is not a toy in any simple sense. Though some may have been handled by children, it can be a way of thinking about domestic space, ancestry, ritual, or the structure of the community. It compresses architecture into an object that can be held, displayed, or deposited. Scholars still debate their functions, but their existence suggests that people were reflecting on houses symbolically, not just living inside them. The megasites also raise practical problems. Feeding large populations, even temporarily, requires planning. Grain must be grown, harvested, stored, transported, and protected. Animals must be managed. Wood must be cut for fuel, construction, pottery firing, and house burning. Clay must be dug in quantity. Water must be accessible. Waste must be dealt with. If population density grew too high, disease risk would increase. If fields expanded too far, labour costs would rise. If nearby woodland was depleted, daily life would become harder. A megasite is not only a symbol of success, it is a machine that consumes its surroundings. This may be one reason these places seem so brilliant and so fragile. Their scale creates social energy, but also environmental pressure. A large settlement can coordinate exchange, ceremony, and labour. It can attract people and goods. It can become a landmark of identity. But it can also strain the soils, woods, and relationships that sustain it. No single explanation fully accounts for the eventual decline of the Trapilia megasites. Yet their very size may have carried the seeds of difficulty. Growth solves some problems and creates others. The most haunting aspect is that these settlements were hidden in plain sight for so long. From the ground, a vast prehistoric site may look like ordinary farmland. Only through excavation, aerial photography, magnetometry, and careful survey do the rings of houses emerge. Modern science reveals the ghost plan of a world that no written source remembered. There is a strange reversal here. The people who built these places may have known them as the centre of everything, visible across the open land, alive with movement and smoke. Later, they became invisible, flattened by agriculture and time. Only instruments could make them visible again. Were these the first cities of Europe? The answer depends on what is meant by city. If a city must have writing, bureaucracy, temples, and permanent administrative hierarchy, then perhaps not. If a city can be a huge planned settlement where thousands of people coordinate life, labour, ritual, exchange, and identity, then the question remains open. The safest answer is that they were something extraordinary in their own right, not failed versions of Mesopotamian cities, but another experiment in living at scale. And that is why the clay cities of Trapilia matter so deeply. They show that Europe's buried old world was not only wealthy in graves or symbolic in signs, it was capable of organising whole landscapes into human patterns. It could build places large enough to challenge the imagination, then burn parts of them in acts that still resist explanation. It could gather people without leaving kings. It could create urban-like scale without writing. It could rise from clay, timber, grain, and fire, and then vanish so completely that the land forgot its shape. Beneath the fields, the rings remain, house after house, circle after circle. The old plans wait in the soil like the memory of a city dreaming without a name. Beneath the practical life of old Europe, beneath fields, houses, pottery, animals, storage pits, tools, and exchange routes, there is another layer that is harder to touch. It is the ritual life of people whose words are gone. Archaeology can uncover a hearth, but not the prayer spoken beside it. It can recover a figurine, but not the gestures gave it meaning. It can map a cemetery, but not the grief, fear, or hope that shaped the ceremony. The spiritual world of Europe's buried civilization survives only in fragments, and yet those fragments are everywhere in bodies, houses, pits, offerings, ornaments, burned rooms, strange deposits, miniature models, and objects placed where ordinary rubbish does not quite explain them. The first mistake would be to imagine ritual as separate from daily life. In many ancient societies, and likely in many prehistoric ones, the sacred is not locked away in special buildings alone. It passes through food, birth, death, fire, animals, ancestors, tools, thresholds, and seasonal change. A house can be practical and sacred at the same time. A storage pit can hold grain 1 year and a meaningful deposit later. A figurine can be handled in a domestic space without being merely domestic. The line between ordinary and ritual may have been much softer than modern categories allow. In the settlements of old Europe, the house stands again at the centre. It is where people sleep, cook, grind grain, repair tools, raise children, store food, and remember the dead. But it may also be a ritual container. Some houses include unusual deposits, objects placed beneath floors, near hearths, at thresholds, or in pits. Some contain figurines, miniature vessels, animal bones, or broken items that seem to have been treated deliberately. Scholars still debate how to interpret these finds. Because the evidence remains incomplete and context varies from site to site. Still, what survives in the record suggests that homes were not merely shelters. They were places where the human, ancestral, natural, and unseen worlds met. Fire has a special place in this hidden ritual landscape. It cooks food, warms bodies, hardens pottery, transforms ore, clears land, destroys houses, and purifies or alters materials. In the Cucuteni Tripilia world, the deliberate burning of houses may have carried meanings linked to closure, renewal, memory, or transformation. In other contexts, fire marks feasting, craft, and deposition. To modernize, a burned layer may first look like disaster, but prehistoric fire can be more ambiguous. It can end a thing properly. It can release it from use. It can make soft clay permanent. It can turn a house into an ancestor of itself. Figurines remain among the most intimate clues. Their bodies are stylized, repeated, sometimes broken, sometimes carefully made, sometimes almost abstract. Earlier generations of scholars and popular writers often placed them into a single grand theory of goddess worship, imagining old Europe as a peaceful world centered on a universal mother deity. That image is evocative, but it goes beyond what the evidence can prove. Some figurines may indeed have had meanings connected to fertility, birth, protection, womanhood, ancestry, or abundance. Others may not. No single explanation fully accounts for their variety. They may have served different purposes at different times, in different communities, even within the same settlement. What matters is that people made them again and again. They took clay from the earth, shaped it into bodies, marked it, fired it, used it, broke it, buried it, discarded it, or placed it carefully. This repeated act suggests a symbolic habit deeply woven into life. A figurine could make the invisible visible. It could stand for a person, a role, a spirit, a memory, a household, a stage of life, or a force that had no simple human form. Its small size does not make it minor. Small objects are easily held, concealed, exchanged, and used in private ceremonies. They can carry meanings too personal or too local for monumental display. Burial practices open another doorway. Across old Europe, the dead are treated in varied ways. Some are placed in formal cemeteries. Some are buried within or near settlements. Some receive grave goods. Others do not. Some graves contain bodies in careful positions, while others include symbolic deposits without complete remains. This variation warns against simple conclusions. A rich grave does not automatically reveal a king. A modest grave does not mean a person was unloved. Treatment in death may reflect age, status, kinship, ritual role, cause of death, community identity, or beliefs that are no longer recoverable. The dead are never only dead in the archaeological record. They are also messages arranged by the living. The Varna cemetery shows this with unusual force. There, grave wealth can be spectacular, and some symbolic graves contain no ordinary body. These burials suggest that social identity could survive beyond physical remains, or that certain roles could be honoured through objects alone. Perhaps some graves commemorated absent individuals. Perhaps they represented ancestors, ritual offices, or sacred powers. Scholars still debate the details, but the cemetery makes one point clearly. Burial was a stage on which society displayed its deepest values. Gold, copper, shell, and carefully arranged objects were not random possessions. They were chosen, placed, and surrendered. Ancestral memory may have been one of the strongest forces in these communities. Settled life encourages the dead to remain close. When generations live in the same place, the landscape fills with remembered bodies and events. A house may stand where an earlier house stood. A path may pass a burial. A mound may grow over older occupation layers. A community does not need written genealogy to feel the weight of ancestry. It can be held in stories, names, objects, rebuilding, and repeated rituals. What survives in the record suggests that old Europe's people lived among accumulated presences, even if we cannot name them. One lesser-known detail is the ritual importance of fragments. Broken objects in prehistoric contexts are not always rubbish in the modern sense. A pot may be broken after a feast. A figurine may be snapped deliberately. A tool may be deposited incomplete. Pieces of objects can travel, be shared, or placed in pits. Fragmentation can create relationships one part kept, one part buried, one part exchanged. Archaeologists must be cautious, because many things break accidentally. But repeated patterns of deposition suggest that breaking itself sometimes mattered. To destroy an object can be a way of changing its status, ending its use, or releasing its power. Animals also belong to this ritual world. Domestic animals feed communities, but they may also carry symbolic meaning. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, dogs, and wild animals appear in bones, figurines, deposits, and imagery. A cattle skull placed deliberately is not the same as kitchen waste. A dog burial may suggest companionship, protection, or special status. Wild animal remains can link people to forests, hunting, danger, or powers outside the domestic sphere. The evidence remains uneven, and no single explanation fully accounts for every animal deposit. But human relationships with animals were clearly more than economic. The underground itself matters. Pits are among the most common and enigmatic features in prehistoric settlements. Some begin as storage pits, clay extraction pits, or refuse pits. Later they may receive carefully placed objects, animal bones, human remains, ash, pottery, or unusual materials. A pit is a hole in the earth, but it is also a boundary. To place something underground is to remove it from daily circulation and give it to depth, darkness, memory, or ancestors. Many deposits may be practical disposal, others seem too deliberate to be dismissed so easily. The difficulty is knowing where one category ends and the other begins. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the story, it is part of the truth. The ritual life of old Europe is visible only through material echoes. It cannot be reconstructed as a single religion with fixed doctrines. There is no sacred book, no carved myth cycle, no priestly instruction manual. There are only patterns of action. People place, burn, bury, break, mark, build, rebuild, and return. From these actions, a world of meaning becomes faintly visible, and that world seems deeply tied to transformation. Clay becomes pottery, ore becomes metal, seed becomes grain, calf becomes cattle wealth, child becomes adult, house becomes ruin, body becomes ancestor, fire, earth, water, and time are not abstract elements. They are the forces through which life changes form. Old Europe's rituals may have helped people manage those transformations, giving shape to uncertainty and continuity to loss. The spiritual landscape beneath Europe is therefore not a hidden temple waiting to be found. It is distributed through ordinary places. It is in the threshold of a house, the ash of a burned wall, the curve of a painted vessel, the face of a figurine, the placement of a shell bead, the posture of a body, the dark fill of a pit. It is a religion of traces, if religion is even the right word. Perhaps belief, memory, custom, and social order were too intertwined to separate. What survives suggests a people who did not merely occupy land. They inhabited a meaningful world. Their settlements were not only economic units. Their houses were not only buildings. Their dead were not simply gone. Their objects were not only tools. Everything could carry memory. Everything could cross a boundary between use and meaning. And beneath the silence of Europe's soil, that ritual life still presses upward. Not as a clear voice, not as decoded doctrine, but as a pattern of care. Someone placed those objects, someone shaped those bodies from clay, someone lit those fires, someone stood beside a grave while gold vanished into the earth. Someone understood what it meant, even if we do not. The hidden civilization beneath Europe remains hidden not because it left nothing behind, but because it left behind a language of action we can only partly read. A civilization can be hidden not because it is isolated, but because its connections leave only scattered traces. Beneath Europe, those traces run through copper, salt, obsidian, shells, pigments, polished stone, animal products, pottery styles, and ideas carried from one community to another long before anyone draws a map of the continent. The people of old Europe do not live in sealed villages, staring only at their own fields. They live inside webs of movement. A river bend, a mountain pass, a shoreline, a salt spring, a source of good stone, a copper-bearing hillside, or a seasonal gathering place can become part of a social world far larger than any single settlement. Trade, in this deep prehistoric setting, should not be imagined too narrowly. There are no market squares with written prices, no coins changing hands, no merchant records listing deliveries. Exchange may happen through gift-giving, marriage alliances, ritual visits, down-the-line contact between neighbouring communities, seasonal gatherings, travelling specialists, or movements of families themselves. An object might pass from hand to hand over years before reaching its final place. A shell bead carried inland may not represent one trader walking from the sea to a distant village. It may represent a chain of relationships, each link adding meaning as well as distance. Salt is one of the quiet powers in this world. It leaves less glamorous evidence than gold, but it is essential to bodies, animals, food preservation, and possibly social influence. Communities with access to salt springs or salt-rich zones may hold something everyone needs. In parts of southeastern Europe, evidence for early salt production suggests that people were not only gathering what lay easily at hand, but organizing labor around valuable resources. Salt does not glitter, but it can shape roots, obligations, and power. A community that controls salt may become important without building a palace. Obsidian tells another story. This volcanic glass can be made into extremely sharp tools, and because its geological sources are limited, its movement can be traced across landscapes. When obsidian appears far from where it formed, it reveals lines of contact stretching through prehistoric Europe. The same is true for certain fine stones used for axes or blades. A polished axe made from non-local material carries more than cutting ability. It carries distance. It shows that someone had access to a network, directly or indirectly, that reached beyond the ordinary horizon. In a world where most people travel by foot or water, distance itself becomes a kind of value. Copper changes the network in a different way. Early copper objects do not replace stone tools all at once, but they introduce new forms of skill and desire, or must be located, extracted, crushed, smelted, shaped, repaired, and understood. The knowledge is specialized, and the materials are unevenly distributed. This creates dependence between regions. A settlement near fertile fields may need metal from uplands. A mining or smelting zone may need food from farming communities. Exchange connects ecological differences into social systems. The land itself becomes divided into complementary powers, grain here or there, salt elsewhere, shells from the coast, timber from woodland, animals from pasture. The surprising detail is how far some materials travel before there are roads in the later sense. Marine shells appear inland. Copper moves away from source zones. Decorative styles spread across broad regions. Certain motifs on pottery echo between communities that may never have been politically unified. These patterns do not prove a single trading class or centralized economy, but they reveal a continent alive with contact. The hidden old world is not hidden because it was small. It is hidden because its largeness was woven through perishable relationships. Objects also move as carriers of ideas. A pot shape can teach a new way of cooking, serving, storing, or presenting food. A figurine style can carry concepts of the body. A house model can reflect shared ideas about domestic space. A metal object can inspire imitation in another material. A burial custom can be noticed, adapted, rejected, or transformed. Exchange is never only economic. Every object arrives with a question attached to it: who made this? Where did it come from? What does it mean? And why does it matter? The Danube and its tributaries remain central, but the network is wider than one river. The Black Sea coast, the Carpathian region, the Balkan Mountains, the forest steppe, the Aegean edges, and Central European plains all participate in different ways. Some communities sit at crossroads between ecological zones. Others become important because of one resource. Still others may gain significance through ritual gatherings rather than material control. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact routes by which particular objects moved. But the general pattern is clear: prehistoric Europe was more connected, more dynamic, and more socially aware of distance than it once appeared. This connectivity creates opportunity, but also vulnerability. A village dependent only on its own fields can suffer from local failure. A settlement tied into wider exchange can draw on distant support, but it also becomes exposed to disruptions beyond its control. If a route shifts, a source is exhausted, a neighboring community collapses, or relations break down, the effects can travel. Networks can carry wealth, but they can also carry instability. They can spread innovations, but also disease, conflict, and social pressure. The same paths that bring shell ornaments and copper tools may bring rumors of violence, failed harvests, or new people moving across the horizon. There is also a social danger in rare goods. Once certain materials become signs of status, not everyone can possess them equally. Gold, copper, shell, fine stone, or exotic pigments can become tools of distinction. A person wearing distant materials on the body is not simply decorated, they display access. They show that their household or lineage is connected. They may claim authority through the visible proof of relationships beyond the village. Such objects can bind communities together through gift and obligation, but they can also sharpen inequality. Wealth is often beautiful before it becomes dangerous. The ordinary people of old Europe may have experienced these networks in ways both practical and mysterious. A farmer might never travel more than a few days from home, yet handle a tool made from stone formed far away. A child might wear a shell bead from waters they have never seen. A potter might copy a design learned from an object brought by marriage partners from another valley. A ritual specialist might use copper, pigment, or shell precisely because it came from beyond the familiar landscape. Distant things often feel powerful because they carry the aura of elsewhere. What survives in the records suggests that Europe's hidden civilization was held together not by conquest, but by circulation. Materials circulated, people circulated, styles circulated, stories must have circulated too, though they have left no direct trace. This circulation may have created a sense of shared world across communities that still remained distinct. The people of a Tripilia megasite, a Vincha settlement, or a Black Sea cemetery were not the same people in a simple ethnic or political sense, but they were not strangers to one another's existence. Their worlds touched. The most fragile part of such a system is trust. Exchange requires expectations. Gifts must be remembered. Marriages must be honoured. Routes must be safe enough. Meetings must be predictable. Ritual obligations must be recognised. In societies without written contracts, memory and reputation do enormous work. A broken promise can damage more than one relationship. A violent encounter can close a route. A death, drought, or failed harvest can ripple outward through alliances. The archaeology rarely captures these moments, but they are the human threads beneath the material pattern. By the time old Europe reaches its height, its settlements are not isolated experiments. They are nodes in a hidden continent of connection. A grave at Varna can contain materials that speak of distant landscapes. A Tripilia pot can carry a style recognizable across wide territories. A copper object can reveal knowledge passed through specialized hands. A salt source can sustain influence without leaving shining treasure. The whole system depends on movement, memory, and the ability of communities to keep exchanging across difference. And here lies another layer of the mystery. The more connected a world becomes, the more impressive it appears, but also the more ways it can fail. A local village can die quietly, a network can unravel, if climate strains harvests, if forests retreat, if soils weaken, if conflict grows, if new groups enter old roots, then the connections that once made old Europe vibrant can transmit shock. What had been a web of strength can become a web of tension. So beneath Europe, the buried civilization is not a set of lonely settlements, but a continent of moving things. Copper from earth, salt from springs, shell from sea, stone from mountains, grain from fields, fire from hearths, meaning from hands. These things cross distances and gather people into relationships that no written archive records. The lost civilization hidden beneath Europe was never truly silent while it lived. It spoke through exchange, and for centuries, the continent answered. For a long time, the world of old Europe seems to grow by solving problems. Forest becomes field, clay becomes house wall, grain becomes stored food, ore becomes copper, river routes become exchange networks, villages become settlements, and settlements become places dense with memory. But every solution creates a new dependence. A community that relies on crops must trust the rain. A settlement that grows large must feed more mouths. A society that clears woodland must keep finding fuel. Timber and pasture, a network that depends on exchange, must keep roots open. Beneath the success of Europe's buried civilization, pressure begins to gather. Climate is never just background in prehistory. It is an actor without a face. It does not explain everything, and scholars still debate how strongly particular climate shifts affected particular regions. But weather shapes the limits within which human choices are made. A few bad seasons can be endured. A longer pattern of drying, cooling, flooding, or instability can change where people live, what they plant, how far animals travel, and whether stored food is enough. In societies without modern transport, irrigation infrastructure, or written administration, local environmental stress can become social stress quickly. The settled farming world is especially vulnerable because its strength is also its weakness. Fields offer predictable food only if conditions remain workable. Soil must retain fertility. Rain must come near the right time. Animals must survive winter. Stored grain must avoid rot, pests, theft, and fire. A mobile foraging group can shift more flexibly when one area fails, though not without hardship. A large farming settlement cannot move so easily. It is tied to houses, fields, graves, paths, memories, and obligations. When the land begins to strain, permanence becomes heavy. Soil exhaustion may have been one quiet pressure. Early farmers could maintain fertility in various ways, including shifting fields, using manure, fallowing land, and expanding cultivation. But growing communities require growing production. Around large settlements, nearby fields may become overused. Woodland clearance can temporarily open fertile land, but it also changes erosion, water flow, fuel availability, and local ecosystems. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be too simple to imagine all old European settlements destroying their landscapes in the same way. But in some regions, the demands of farming, grazing, building, pottery firing, and house burning must have increased pressure on local resources. Wood is one of the most underestimated materials in the story, because it rarely survives. Modern observers forget how much ancient life consumes it. Houses need posts, beams, wattle, roofs, repairs, fences, tools, fuel, ovens, pottery kilns, metalworking fires, and ordinary hearths. Large settlements need enormous amounts of wood, and the tripilia practice of burning houses, where it occurred deliberately, would have added to that demand. A settlement surrounded by once abundant woodland might slowly find that good timber must be brought from farther away. The change might not be dramatic at first. A longer walk, a harder day, a poorer beam, but over generations, such costs matter. Water brings another kind of uncertainty. Rivers nourish settlement, but floodplains are unstable. A river can deposit fertile silt and then destroy a field. It can shift course, isolate a crossing, drown animals, or turn paths into mud. In drier periods, smaller streams may shrink, wells may fail, and pasture may suffer. The people of old Europe would have known their local waters intimately, but knowledge does not equal control. A community can adapt to regular cycles. It is the unusual sequence, the repeated failure, the pattern outside memory that breaks confidence. There may also have been demographic pressure. Farming communities can grow, more children survive in some contexts, and settled life can support higher population densities. Growth is strength when land and food are sufficient, It becomes danger when they are not. More people mean more fields, more animals, more waste, more disputes, more disease risk, and more need for coordination. If social systems cannot absorb the pressure, people leave, divide, compete, or change their way of life. Collapse often begins not with emptiness, but with too much success under changing conditions. Disease is difficult to trace, but it should not be ignored. Dense settlements, domestic animals, stored food, insects, rodents, and waste create new health environments. Not every illness leaves clear marks on bone. Epidemics can pass through a community and leave little direct archaeological evidence. Scholars still debate the role of disease in the transformations of late Neolithic and Copper Age Europe, especially before clear genetic evidence for particular pathogens appears in later periods. The safe conclusion is modest settled life increased certain risks, and large communities would have had to manage them without understanding microbes in any modern sense. One lesser-known environmental detail is the importance of small-scale variation. Climate change is often discussed as if it affects whole continents evenly, but prehistoric communities lived locally. One valley might remain productive while another suffered. A south-facing slope might succeed when lower fields failed. A wetland might buffer drought for one group and spread disease for another. This unevenness can produce migration, envy, exchange, or conflict. People do not respond to average climate. They respond to the hunger, mud, frost, pests, and scarcity in front of them. As pressure builds, the signs may not look like sudden collapse. A settlement is abandoned, another shrinks, a pottery style changes, long-distance goods become rarer, houses are rebuilt less often, burial customs shift. People move into smaller sites or different ecological zones. Communities that once gathered at large centres may stop coming. None of these changes alone proves disaster. Together, across regions and centuries, they suggest a world becoming less stable. The old patterns are losing their force. But environmental explanations must be handled carefully. It is tempting to say that climate caused the decline of the old Europe, as if weather alone pushed people aside. That is too simple. Climate does not act on empty societies. It acts on systems of land use, belief, authority, exchange, technology, and memory. A drought that one small group can survive may be devastating for a large settlement with strained soils and rigid obligations. A cooling trend may matter more where crops are already marginal. A flood may become catastrophic if houses and storage are concentrated in vulnerable places. Environment and society interlock. The people living through these changes would not have experienced them as a neat archaeological phase. They would have felt them as particular anxieties, a field that yields less, a herd weakened by poor pasture, a roof repaired with inferior timber, a storage pit spoiled, a journey to obtain salt or copper made dangerous by tensions along the route, a gathering where fewer people arrive than before, a burned house not rebuilt, a young family leaving for another valley, a grave with fewer offerings. History, at ground level, is made of such details. The fragility of old Europe does not diminish its achievements. It makes them more human. The large settlements, gold graves, copper tools, painted vessels, and symbolic objects were not created outside nature. They were built within demanding landscapes by people who had to negotiate every season. Their civilization was not a machine steadily advancing toward modernity. It was a living arrangement, brilliant in places, vulnerable in others, always dependent on the balance between human ambition and environmental tolerance. As the climate begins to turn, or perhaps as climate instability combines with social and ecological stress, the hidden civilization enters a more uncertain phase. Its networks remain impressive, but networks under pressure can fray. Its settlements remain meaningful, but meaningful places can become difficult to sustain. Its rituals remain powerful, but rituals may not bring rain, restore soil, stop sickness, or settle disputes over land. The old solutions no longer solve everything. And beyond the fields, beyond the river corridors, beyond the burned houses and gold graves, another horizon is beginning to matter more. From the grasslands north of the Black Sea and farther east, new patterns of life are moving into contact with the old farming world. They bring different relationships to animals, mobility, burial, ancestry, and power. The pressure on old Europe is not only coming from weather and land, it is also coming from people whose world is shaped by the open steppe. Beyond the settled fields and river valleys of old Europe lies a different kind of world. It is wider, drier in places, more open to movement, and less anchored to the same kind of village permanence. The steppe north of the Black Sea is not empty. It is a landscape of grasslands, river corridors, seasonal pastures, burial mounds, mobile communities, animals, and horizons that seem to pull human life outward rather than hold it in one place. To the farmers of southeastern Europe, this world may have appeared familiar at its edges and strange at its depths. It was not another planet. It was a neighbouring way of life, and over time, that neighbouring world began to press more strongly into the old settled one. The meeting between old Europe and the steppe is one of the most debated transformations in European prehistory. It is tempting to imagine it as a simple invasion, a wave of horse-riding warriors sweeping in and destroying peaceful farming cultures. That image has been powerful, especially in popular accounts, but the archaeological and genetic evidence points to a more complicated process. There were migrations, there were changes in ancestry, there were shifts in burial customs, mobility, economy, and probably language. There may also have been conflict in some places, integration in others, marriage, exchange, alliance, and gradual cultural transformation. No single explanation fully accounts for every region or every century. The steppe communities brought different habits of life. Their worlds were shaped more strongly by herding, movement, and the management of animals across open landscapes. Horses would eventually become central to steppe power, though the timing and nature of early horse use remain debated. Cattle, sheep, goats, and other domestic animals also mattered deeply. Mobility allowed communities to exploit wide territories, respond to seasonal pasture, and maintain social networks across distances that would have seemed large to more settled farmers. Where old Europe invested identity in houses and dense settlements, steppe societies often invested memory in burial landscapes, lineages, herds, and movement. The burial mound becomes one of the most visible signs of this shift. In parts of the steppe, and later across broader regions, the kurgan, or burial mound, marks the land in a way very different from the cemeteries and house-centered worlds of many farming societies. A mound rises above the surface. It makes ancestry visible from a distance. It claims memory in open space. It says that the dead are not only placed in the earth, they are made into landmarks. This does not mean every mound represents a conqueror, and it does not mean all steppe communities were the same, but the form itself carries a different relationship to land and the dead. For the people of old Europe, contact with mobile herding groups could have brought valuable exchanges: animals, hides, dairy products, tools, ornaments, and information may have moved between worlds. Farmers and herders often need one another, even when they distrust one another. Grain and metal can move one way, livestock and steppe products another. Marriage can bridge communities. Frontier zones are rarely clean lines. They are places where languages mix, customs shift, and children grow up understanding more than one world. But frontiers can also become violent. Stored grain, livestock, land, and prestige goods create reasons for raiding and defense. Mobile groups can strike differently from settled ones. Settled communities, tied to houses and fields, may be vulnerable if conflict intensifies. The archaeological evidence for violence is uneven, and scholars still debate its scale, but trauma on skeletons, fortified sites in some regions, burned settlements, and abrupt cultural changes remind us that peaceful exchange was not the only possibility. Human contact has always carried both curiosity and danger. The genetic evidence has added a powerful new dimension to this story. Studies of ancient DNA show significant movements of people from steppe-related populations into parts of Europe during the later 4th and 3rd millennia BC. This does not map perfectly onto every archaeological culture, and genes are not the same as language, identity, or political power. But they do show that the transformation was not only a matter of ideas spreading. People moved, mixed, and in some places dramatically altered the ancestry of later populations. The evidence remains incomplete because ancient DNA coverage varies, but the broad signal is now difficult to ignore. This raises the controversial question of Indo-European languages. Many scholars connect steppe expansions with the spread of early Indo-European languages into Europe, though the exact routes, timings, and mechanisms remain debated. It is important to be careful. Archaeology cannot hear prehistoric speech directly, and genetic ancestry does not automatically equal language. Still, the steppe hypothesis remains one of the major mainstream models for explaining how many Indo-European languages spread, if it is broadly correct. Then the meeting between Old Europe and the steppe was not only a demographic and cultural event, it may have helped reshape the linguistic future of the continent. Yet the people living through it would not have thought in those terms. They would not have imagined themselves as agents in the spread of a language family. They would have seen strangers, neighbours, marriage partners, rivals, traders, raiders, or kin. They would have noticed different burial customs, different clothing, different animal practices, different movements across land. They might have adopted useful things without abandoning everything. They might have resisted some customs and embraced others. Cultural change often happens unevenly. A burial rite here, a tool form there, a new ancestry in one family, an old pottery tradition continuing in another. One lesser-known detail is that the transformation of Europe was not just about the arrival of new people, but about the changing value of mobility itself. In a world under environmental stress, mobile herding can become more attractive. If fields are less reliable, herds that can move may offer resilience. If exchange networks strain, groups able to travel widely may gain advantage. If large settlements become difficult to sustain, smaller and more mobile communities may seem better suited to the times. The steppe did not simply impose change from outside. It may have offered solutions to problems already growing within the farming world. The old house-centered societies must have felt this shift deeply. In old Europe, identity had often been tied to place houses, villages, cemeteries, fields, settlement plans, and ancestral layers beneath the feet. The steppe brought a different emphasis: ancestry marked by mounds, wealth carried in animals, power moving across distance, memory spread through roots rather than dense settlement layers. Neither world was simple, Neither was pure, but their meeting changed the direction of European history. Some old European traditions persisted, transformed, or were absorbed. People did not vanish like smoke. Descendants remained, skills continued, farming continued, pottery continued in altered forms. Local knowledge survived. Women and men from older communities likely became part of new social worlds through marriage and incorporation. At the same time, some ways of life ended. The great Tripilia megasites declined. Certain symbolic systems faded. The old settlement patterns lost their dominance. The hidden civilization did not necessarily die in a single act of conquest, but it ceased to be itself. This is why replacement versus integration is too blunt a choice. In some regions, steppe-related ancestry may have arrived dramatically. In others, local continuity remained stronger. In some places, violence may have played a role. In others, alliance and intermarriage may have mattered more. A map of the transformation would not show one colour sweeping cleanly over another. It would show gradients, pockets, corridors, ruptures, and survivals. The evidence still grows as new excavations and genetic studies appear, but the older idea of a completely isolated old Europe ending neatly before a completely new Europe begins no longer holds. The horizon that once seemed distant becomes part of the village world. Burial customs shift, social values change, mobility gains prestige, herding economies expand in importance, new forms of ancestry and authority appear. The continent begins moving toward the Bronze Age, toward societies more familiar in some ways and more violent in others, toward chariots, fortified places, metal weapons, and eventually the written edges of history. But beneath that later world remains the older one. Partly buried, partly absorbed, partly forgotten, the steppe did not simply destroy the lost civilization hidden beneath Europe. It entered into the crisis of a world already under pressure, and together climate, land use, social strain, migration, and cultural encounter transformed the continent. What emerged was not the same as what came before. The old clay houses, painted vessels, gold graves, symbolic marks, and megasites became traces of a path not taken, or perhaps a path that continued underground through ancestry, memory, and fragments of practice. At the edge of old Europe, the open grasslands had always been there. For centuries, they were a neighbouring horizon. Then the horizon moved closer, and when it did, Europe's buried civilization entered its final transformation. The end of old Europe does not look like one city falling in flames while terrified crowds flee through broken gates. It is stranger than that, and harder to hold in the imagination. It is a fading pattern, a transformation spread across centuries, a series of local endings that only later become visible as a continental shift. One settlement is abandoned, another changes its layout, a cemetery stops receiving the same kinds of offerings. A pottery tradition weakens or merges with another. Long-distance goods become rarer in one region and more common in another. Houses are no longer built in the old way. The great megasites lose their force. The buried civilization does not vanish in a single night. It becomes something else, unevenly, painfully, and without leaving an explanation in words. This is why collapse is the wrong word if it is used too simply. Collapse suggests a clean break, a before and after, a structure standing tall and then lying in ruins. Some parts of old Europe may indeed have experienced sharp disruption, but the wider story is more complicated. People survived, farming continued, animals were still herded, children were still born, clay was still shaped, fires still burned in houses. What disappeared was a particular arrangement of life. The dense symbolic world of certain Neolithic and Copper Age cultures, the great settlement systems, the old exchange networks, the distinctive ritual habits, the social patterns that had made this hidden civilization recognizable. Several explanations compete, and none is sufficient alone. Environmental pressure likely played a role in some areas. Soil exhaustion, woodland depletion, unstable rainfall, cooling or drying episodes, and the costs of sustaining large populations could weaken the foundations of settlement life. A megasite requires a surrounding landscape capable of feeding it and supplying timber, fuel, clay, pasture, and water. If those demands grow too heavy, the settlement may become less a centre of abundance than a centre of strain. But environment alone does not explain why some traditions change as they do, or why new burial customs and steppe-related influences appear across broad regions. Migration also matters, but it too must be handled carefully. Steppe-related populations moved into parts of Europe and contributed to major demographic and cultural change. This is one of the most important findings of recent prehistoric research. Yet migration is not a single event with one meaning. Migrants can arrive as raiders, herders, spouses, allies, refugees, traders, or whole communities seeking new land. They can dominate, blend, imitate, or be absorbed in one region. Their arrival may produce violence and replacement. In another, gradual integration. In another, a hybrid society that would have seemed normal to those living in it and confusing to later archaeologists. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the variation. Conflict may have intensified in some places. Stored grain, livestock, metal goods, fertile land, salt sources, and exchange routes all create reasons for competition. Larger settlements can be powerful, but they can also be targets. If trust between communities weakens, if mobile groups raid settled ones, if local rivalries harden under scarcity, then violence can become part of the transformation. But warfare alone does not explain the end either. Destruction layers are uneven. Many abandonments may have been planned or gradual. Some changes occur without clear evidence of attack. The old world was not simply conquered everywhere by force. Disease remains one of the most difficult possibilities. Dense settlements and contact networks can spread illness. And later, ancient DNA has shown that pathogens could move through prehistoric populations. But proving the role of disease in the decline of specific old European cultures is hard. Many illnesses leave no obvious skeletal signature. A community can be devastated biologically and leave little more than a break in settlement continuity. Scholars still debate how much disease contributed to these transformations. It is possible that epidemics formed part of the pressure, especially where large settlements, animals, and long-distance movement intersected, but the evidence cannot carry the whole story by itself. Internal social strain may be just as important. Inequality, once visible, can destabilize communities. Rich graves, prestige goods, control over resources, ritual authority, or unequal access to exchange networks may create tensions within societies that had once depended on household cooperation. If elites or ritual specialists could no longer justify their position during bad harvests, conflict or fragmentation might follow. If large communities required consensus and consensus failed, people could leave. A settlement does not need to be destroyed from outside if enough households decide it no longer offers a future. There is also the possibility that the old symbolic order lost its grip. Civilizations are not held together by food alone. They depend on shared meanings why houses are built in certain ways, why the dead are buried with certain objects, why gatherings occur, why exchanges matter, why people remain loyal to a place. When conditions change, old rituals may stop answering new fears. A burned house may no longer renew the world. A sign on clay may no longer carry authority. A gathering centre may no longer draw people from the surrounding region. Once belief in a pattern weakens, the pattern can unravel quickly, even if no enemy appears at the gate. The decline of the Tripilia megasites shows how complex such endings can be. Their scale was extraordinary, but scale can become a burden. If these sites functioned partly as gathering centres, then their survival depended on people continuing to come, build, exchange, and participate. If regional networks changed, if smaller communities withdrew, if resources became strained, the megasite could lose its purpose. It might not be abandoned because everyone starved or fled. It might be abandoned because the social reason for maintaining it disappeared. That kind of collapse leaves few dramatic traces. It looks like absence. A lesser-known but important point is that disappearance in archaeology often means disappearance of a recognizable pattern, not disappearance of human beings. The people of old Europe did not all die out. Many were absorbed into later populations. Their descendants may have farmed under new customs, married into steppe-influenced groups, adopted new burial rites, spoke new languages over generations, or preserved older practices in altered forms. The civilization vanished as a cultural system. But human lives continued through mixture and adaptation. In this sense, the lost civilization is both gone and not gone. It survives biologically and materially, while its identity becomes unreadable. This makes the ending more haunting. A sudden catastrophe can be mourned as tragedy. A slow transformation is more elusive. At what moment does a civilization cease to be itself? When the last megasite is abandoned, when the last old-style figurine is made, when burial customs change. When a child grows up speaking a different language from their grandmother, when people no longer remember why their ancestors burned houses or marked clay signs, the answer may never be recoverable. Cultural death is not always a date. Sometimes it is a forgetting spread across generations. By the time the Bronze Age approaches, Europe is moving into a new world. Mobility, metallurgy, warrior identities, new burial customs, and wider steppe-linked transformations reshape the continent. The old Neolithic and Copper Age networks do not simply continue unchanged. Some are broken, some rerouted, some absorbed. Power begins to look different. Graves increasingly emphasize individuals in new ways. Metal weapons and prestige objects become more prominent. Fortified sites appear in later periods. The continent is not yet the Europe of written history, but it has turned away from the path old Europe once seemed to be exploring. And still, the end is not failure. Old Europe did not need to become Egypt or Mesopotamia to matter. Its disappearance does not mean it was primitive, unstable by nature, or doomed from the beginning. It was a real and remarkable experiment in settled life, symbolic richness, craft, exchange, and social scale. It rose under particular conditions and transformed when those conditions changed. That is not an exception in human history. It is one of history's deepest patterns. The buried civilization beneath Europe therefore ends as many civilizations end not with a single cause, but with convergence, climate pressure, land use, demographic growth, inequality, disease risk, migration, changing values, and conflict may all have played their parts in different proportions. Each region had its own story. Each settlement had its own final season. Each household faced its own decision to stay, rebuild, move, adapt, or abandon. From a distance, it becomes collapse. Up close, it is life under pressure. What remains is the archaeological silence after transformation. The old mark stops speaking even faintly. The gold graves become rare echoes of a vanished order. The great clay settlements lie flattened beneath fields. Houses that once held families become fired rubble. Rivers continue to move through valleys that have forgotten the names of those who lived beside them. The old world does not announce its end. It sinks into the soil, leaving later Europe to grow above it. Unaware that another civilization had already risen, struggled, and changed beneath its feet. What still lies beneath Europe is not a single lost city waiting for its gates to be opened. It is wider, quieter, and more difficult to grasp. It lies under farmland, suburbs, industrial zones, river terraces, vineyards, orchards, roads, and ordinary villages where daily life continues without any visible sign of the older worlds below. A tractor turns soil where a Neolithic house once stood. A road cuts near a vanished path. A modern town rises above layers of settlement, abandonment, rebuilding and forgetting. The hidden civilization beneath Europe survives not as a monument but as a scattered memory pressed into the land. Its legacy begins with the simplest fact: Europe's deep past was far more complex than it once appeared. Before classical civilization, before Rome, before Greece's written histories, before the familiar Bronze Age warrior societies, there were communities experimenting with settlement, craft, ritual, exchange, and scale in ways that still challenge modern categories. They did not become states in the way Mesopotamia did. They did not leave royal inscriptions. They did not carve their victories into stone, but they built dense settlements, worked metal, displayed wealth, moved goods across long distances, created symbolic systems, shaped elaborate pottery, honoured the dead, and gathered people into places large enough to make the word village feel inadequate. This matters because history is often told by the societies that learned how to advertise themselves most loudly. Stone monuments survive, written records survive, kings survive as names, even when their kingdoms fall. But timber, clay, textile, song, and oral memory are more vulnerable. Old Europe was made largely from materials that time does not flatter. Its houses collapsed into soil. Its wooden structures vanished. Its fabrics decayed. Its spoken traditions dissolved. What remains is only the harder residue of a much fuller life. The evidence remains incomplete, but enough survives to reveal that absence of writing is not absence of civilization. The buried world also leaves a genetic and cultural inheritance, though not in any simple or pure form. The people of old Europe mixed with others, including later steppe-related populations, and their descendants became part of the continent's changing human fabric. No modern nation can claim them as an untouched ancestral possession. They belong to a time before modern identities, before Europe's later languages and borders took their familiar forms. Their legacy is shared, tangled, and transformed. It lives not as a straight bloodline or a national myth, but as part of the deep human mixture from which later Europe emerged. Archaeology continues to change the picture. Magnetometry reveals settlement plans without fully excavating them. Ancient DNA complicates old theories of migration and continuity. Isotope analysis tracks movement, diet, and childhood landscapes. Microscopic residue studies reveal what vessels once held. Radiocarbon dating tightens chronologies that were once vague. Every method adds detail, but also new uncertainty. The more scholars learn, the less the old simple stories survive. Old Europe was not a peaceful paradise. It was not a primitive backwater. It was not a lost empire with hidden technology. It was something more real, a network of human societies building meaning under difficult conditions. Some mysteries remain especially stubborn. The signs on clay still resist confident translation. The exact role of many figurines remains debated. The social organization of the Tripilia megasites is not settled. The meaning of deliberate house burning remains contested. The nature of power behind Varna's richest graves is still unclear. The balance between climate stress, internal change, migration, and violence in the decline of these societies remains complex. No single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence, and that is part of what makes the subject endure. The buried civilization keeps refusing to become simple. Yet its greatest lesson may be about fragility. These societies were not weak, but they were dependent on balances that could change soil, rain, woodland, exchange, trust, ritual authority, demographic pressure, and relations with neighboring worlds. Their achievements were built from cooperation and repeated labor, but also from systems that could strain under their own success. A large settlement is impressive until it becomes too costly to sustain. A trade network is powerful until its roots fail. A ritual order is binding until people stop believing it can carry them through crisis. Civilizations do not always fall because they lack intelligence. Sometimes they fall because intelligence is not enough. Beneath Europe, then, is a warning and a wonder. The warning is that permanence is often an illusion. The wonder is that people keep making it anyway. They clear fields, build houses, bury their dead, mark clay, shape metal, teach children, repair roofs, and imagine that the world they know will continue. In this, old Europe is not distant at all. Its people lived with different tools and beliefs, but they faced a recognizable human problem: how to make a home in time. Their world still lies underfoot, not fully lost, not fully found, waiting in fragments, waiting in burned clay, gold beads, dark soil stains, river terraces, broken figurines, and rings of houses visible only when instruments read the earth like a faded manuscript. Europe's later civilizations rose above them, but never completely erased them. The land kept the memory, and slowly, patiently, archaeology is learning how to listen. The land is quiet now. The fires that hardened the clay walls have gone out. The houses that once stood in great rings are gone from the surface. The hands that shaped the figurines, polished the axes, gathered salt, painted vessels, worked gold, and pressed signs into wet clay have returned to the same earth they once tried to make permanent. Above them, Europe changed its languages, its gods, its roads, its kingdoms, and its borders many times over. Forests fell and returned, rivers shifted. Fields were opened again. Villages rose where older villages had already vanished. The old world sank deeper, not because it was unreal, but because time is patient with everything humans build. What remains is not enough to tell the whole story, yet it is enough to feel the weight of it. A broken pot is not just a broken pot when it is the last surviving edge of a meal, a ritual, a household, or a journey. A burned floor is not only evidence of fire, but the shadow of a home that once held warmth, labour, fear, and memory. A grave filled with gold is not only treasure, but a final act of belief by people who thought the dead still mattered. Even the undeciphered marks on clay have their own quiet dignity. They do not speak clearly, but they remind us that silence is not emptiness. The lost civilization hidden beneath Europe did not disappear into nothing. It became soil, ancestry, influence, unanswered questions, and scattered traces. Its people did not know they were living before history. They were simply living inside their own present, as every civilization does, trusting the strength of houses, fields, ceremonies, roots, and inherited ways. Some of those things endured, some failed, some were absorbed into new worlds, some became unreadable. And perhaps that is the most human part of the story. Every society builds as if its meanings will last. Every generation repairs walls it did not raise, walks paths it did not begin, and leaves behind fragments it cannot choose. Thousands of years later, strangers kneel in the soil and try to understand. So the hidden Europe remains beneath the visible one, not as a myth of impossible grandeur, but as something more haunting a real human world, vast in effort, fragile in survival, and only partly remembered. Under the fields, the old house rings still sleep. Under the river mist, the roots remain. Under the quiet ground, a civilization without a voice keeps its final shape, waiting in clay, ash, bone, and gold